Good evening, Tom.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Do an over-under on how long this is going to take.
Ready?
Yes, we are.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the San Bruno City Special Council meeting of March 29th, 2022. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Hamilton? Councilmember Hamilton? I don't think he can hear us.
Mr. Hamilton is present. We can see him.
Yes. Councilmember Medina?
Here.
Councilmember Salazar?
Here.
Vice Mayor Mason? Here. Mayor Medina?
Here.
And I
Now
will try to contact Councilmember Hamilton to let him know that he can't
Thank
hear
you.
us.
Public comments for items not on the agenda. We have a study session tonight on various items. Other than that, is there any members of the public that wish to speak at this time? Items not, excuse me, not on the agenda. Not seeing any at this time. We will move on to our business at hand, which is a study session. We have a few items. The first item is A, conduct study session and provide direction regarding the process and next steps to become a charter city. And I think unless our city manager and attorney say different, we'll take each item one by one, open it to the public after the presentation and getting questions. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the city manager. Please.
Okay, we're on. Thank you, Mayor Medina. The city attorney and I will do this presentation jointly, and the city attorney has the first component. So, Mark Bruno.
Thank you very much. And just making sure that everybody can hear us in the room. Very good. All right. Well, welcome, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. Tonight we have a study session to discuss a variety of potential ballot items for the November 2022 election. And let's now note that our control isn't working. Okay. It's working. Okay. Great. Thank you. So we have a couple of items on the agenda. We'll do a brief introduction, and then we'll step through the four items that are sort of the main topics for tonight: the establishment of a charter city, elective office of mayor, term limits, and local campaign finance regulations, and we'll end with a summary. We're starting with Charter City primarily because that's actually the most robust, substantive staff report that we have, and will likely drive the decisions on some of the other items. So bear with us while we go through our presentation, and we'll try to be succinct and then take any questions after each particular item has been displayed. And we'll also want everybody to note that at the end of each item, we'll have a series of questions for the City Council to answer. And so we'll pause at the end of each one of those and allow the City Council to provide direction. So without any further ado, let's talk very briefly about the goals for tonight's meeting, which are to, first of all, determine whether to establish a city charter with integral commercial real estate transfer tax. We've talked about that before, and it's been on the City Council's priority initiatives. And then the second subtopic is to determine whether the four other items should also be on the November 22 ballot, or should they be integral to a proposed city charter if they're going to be on the ballot. And we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of doing it one way or the other as we get into the presentation. So pictures are worth 1,000 words, and so I'd like to thank the city manager's office for helping me with my let's just say slightly below average PowerPoint skills. And there are essentially two methods to address the issue of ballot questions. We can go with method A, which is to have a city charter with a commercial property transfer tax. and in that charter also propose one or more of those other items as an integral part of a charter. Or method B, which is to put a relatively simple city charter on the ballot that includes a commercial property transfer tax, and then have those items separately outlined as separate ballot measures for the public to vote yes or no on. And one reason why you might want to consider doing that is because if those items are integral to a city charter, it may affect the number of people who vote for the charter and hence the transfer tax, because they may or may not like some of those other items. And so they might vote yes or no just based on that one issue, as opposed to perhaps adopting a charter with a transfer tax, and then they're free to vote yes or no on those other items. And the last comment I'll make about this slide is just pause to note, and this will become clear later, that campaign finance regulations are not matters that are required to be on the ballot. So the City Council has the inherent authority to adopt campaign finance regulations locally if it wishes to do so. The other matters, a city charter, the transfer tax, rotational mayor, and term limits are all required to be on the ballot and require a vote of the people. And moreover, the alternative voting methods that were discussed at a recent City Council study session cannot be adopted by general law cities. They must be adopted by a charter city. So there'll be a question later on about whether you want to integrate those alternative voting methods into your city charter, or perhaps have be a standalone item, or perhaps not at all. And that's the decision that you'll be making on each of those items. So let's pause for just a moment and take a look and talk very briefly about establishing a city charter. So what's the difference? And in essence, only charter cities can impose the real property transfer tax. There are other differences between charter cities and general law cities. Those differences over the years have been shrinking, I think, as you read in the staff report, because the courts have found that matters that were previously determined to be municipal affairs and thus amenable to a charter are actually matters of statewide concern. And I'm using air quotes because that's really what the two words are: municipal affairs versus matters of statewide concern. And only municipal affairs can be dealt with in a city charter. So what might those things be? Well, there are things like election rules, city council governance, contracts. There's some differences in the zoning regulations that charter cities can adopt. But the important thing to keep in mind is if you put it in the city charter and the public votes on it, the only way to change that is with an amendment to the charter, and that requires a vote of the people. So it's important to think carefully about what's in your charter and take those steps carefully and with due deliberation. What the city of El Cerrito did, which was a model that we looked at City Council's direction, is adopted a very simple charter. It's actually about 4 pages long, and it in essence includes the real property transfer tax and a couple of other provisions that give the city all of the powers of a charter city, while also saying that it's to follow general state law unless it's in the charter. And so that sort of gave them the best of both worlds, the flexibility to adopt a charter with a tax, but then also to evolve that charter as time went on. There are a couple of ways to propose a charter to the voters, and what the City Council selected is to draft the charter itself, and that requires 2 public hearings and a vote of the people, as I indicated, with a majority vote to adopt. And what the City Council did, that as we understood it, was to develop a simple charter with this integrated commercial real property transfer tax. So let's pause for a second and talk about that, because that's really the main topic for tonight's discussion about city charter. So what is a real property transfer tax? Well, it's a tax on the sale of property. It's only paid when property is sold. It can be negotiated between the buyer and seller, just like everything else can be. It's often wrapped up into the loan for the property. But there are a couple of key issues for the City Council to discuss. And the first question is, what is the definition of commercial? And the City Council had previously directed staff to exclude residential properties from the tax. And that's certainly possible for the City Council to do. There's no legal reason why it can't do that, although I'll note that no other cities that we've been able to find who have this tax actually make that distinction. But if the city council wishes, they can do so. And then the next question is, well, what is commercial property? Are you going to exclude residential property in some way, or are you going to exempt transactions that are under a specific dollar amount for those properties? So we now have a couple of slides that the city manager is going to start out with, which will have the city council dig a little bit more deeply into the definitions of commercial property and the definitions that you'll be presented with tonight.
Thank you, Mark. You bet. I guess I can say good evening. Good evening, City Council. I'll take us through, as Mark said, a few slides with respect to definition of commercial property as well as potential tax rates. I just want to go back really quick to something that the city attorney said, because I think the spirit of it is true, but I just want to say that I don't think that council directed us to not include residential properties. I think that there was a discussion around having the tax be centered on commercial properties, but we really never delved down into the definition of commercial. And I remember conversations around exclusions of single-family homes, for example. And so what we want to do right now is to delve down a little bit more deeply into how commercial property is defined. And really the casual definition of commercial property is property that produces income for its owner. There are commercial property brokers that sell residential real estate. And so types of commercial property in general are shown on the screen. And so that's your office building, hotel, a retail structure, industrial property, think of a warehouse or light manufacturing building. Multifamily housing complexes should really be distinguished from an apartment complex versus a condo. A condo complex where individual units are sold is not commercial property. That is typically residential real estate. However, you could have the building that looks identical, but it's a rental property owned by one or multiple owners, but the units are rental. When that property sells, that is a commercial property transaction, and it's a multifamily dwelling. Planned unit developments by residential developers. Think of big sites that a developer will purchase and then develop a number of different product types, maybe single-family homes, maybe duplexes, and there may even be some streets that are built and then dedicated to the city. But think of a larger development and a larger transaction. And vacant property is oftentimes considered commercial property if it's in a commercial zone. And so while we have yet to define for the purposes of a potential commercial property transfer tax what commercial is, we did want to prepare a tax simulation analysis. And so we did that, and we picked a definition. And I just want to highlight that we used the definition that's shown, and the only difference between the 5 items that I went through now is that we peg a multifamily housing complex as a complex that has 5 units or greater. Council has the discretion to change that, but in preparing that financial analysis, we wanted to have a definition, and we just picked that as a starting point. As the city attorney said, the city council has a number of decisions to make, also with regard to exemptions. First, we can say, are we exempting residential property, either all or in part? And there are a number of various ways to do that. We can simply only exempt single-family homes. The city council could exempt single-family homes in duplexes. With a component there is there an owner-occupied exemption? For example, if a duplex sold, but both of the units were rental units and it wasn't owner-occupied, would that be subject to the commercial property transfer tax? Or would you provide for that duplex to be exempted if one of the units was occupied by the owner at the time of the sale? There could be an exemption of all residential dwellings up to a triplex or up to 4plexes, or potentially up to a 5plex. Also, you could simply just have a owner-occupied exemption. and so you would not specify type. But if the property is owner occupied, it is exempt from the transfer tax. And if you chose that option, you'd probably just call it transfer tax, not commercial property transfer tax, because at that point a single family home would sell, but if it was owner occupied, it would be subject to the tax. Additionally, probably would say equally common method would be to pick a threshold, either for residential properties or all properties. And by threshold, I mean financial threshold. And so you can pick, for example, as shown there in the first bullet, an exemption for residential property sales under $3 million, or an exemption for all property sales under $3 million, or an exemption where you stratify that and you have a price for residential property and potentially a second price for all other properties. So what's shown is potentially a residential property exemption up at $3 million or less, and all other properties would be exempted at $5 million or less. And of course, any other combinations thereof. Also, there's probably a small print for council and people at home, but we just wanted to note that other common property tax exemptions, such as those that are available for religious and governmental properties, would apply. What we're really talking about is what would be those localized exemptions that council would specify in the potential ballot measure. Now, if we turn to potential property transfer tax rates, in order to provide a benchmarking analysis of what are the transfer tax rates that other cities have, we really looked at the Bay Area, and we picked 21 cities in the Bay Area, or we found 21 cities in the Bay Area that have a transfer tax. I would not say that this is all the cities. There very well may be more in the San Francisco Bay Area that have a property transfer tax, but we were able to identify 21. And I think it's a pretty good sampling. And so you have that as an attachment to the staff report. For this analysis, now it's a transfer tax fluctuates with the economy, and so it's very susceptible to economic swings. And so revenue in one year may be drastically different from revenue in another year. In particular, any economic cycle where the interest rate is affected, either interest rates going low, you may have more property sales, or interest rates going very high, you may have fewer property sales, can impact transfer tax revenue. And so in order to provide an estimate, we didn't want to make an estimate prospectively, because if we could pick when the downturn in the economy happened, we'd be on Wall Street making a ton of money. And so we wanted to do a backward look. And so we looked at actual sales in the city of San Bruno for the past 5 years. And we ran that analysis against the transfer tax models in those 21 cities. And so depending on the model that is picked, the city had a transfer tax been in place. The city could have received a range of $61,000 a year to an average of $2.7 million a year over the last 5 years. Again, extremely dependent upon the rate that is chosen. For those 21 cities, there are various tax structures, a simple percentage or a tier rate based on price. And so the range for those that had a simple percentage rate, it really ranged from 0.55% up to 1.3%. And then there were a number of cities that had a tiered structure. And so what we show on the screen is Richmond, Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, and San Jose. And depending on the value of the sale, a different rate applied. And I won't go through all of these, but for example, the city of Richmond, under $1 million, the transfer tax was 0.7%. Between $1 million to $3 million, the transfer tax rate was 1.25%. Between 3 to 10 million, 2.5, and over 10 million, 3%. I'll highlight that the highest rate in all of these 5 cities is 3%. Richmond and San Jose have that threshold at anything above 10 million, and then San Francisco, anything above 25 million is charged at 3%. And I would say the San Francisco has more of a tiered range of 6 different categories, and Oakland has a similar 4 different categories, but starting at 300,000 or up to 300,000 with lowest rate, and where San Francisco anything over 100,000. But what you can see from this is that there are various different ways to structure the analysis. I'll turn it back to our city attorney, who will take us through a few more slides on this topic.
Thank you very much, Devon. One of the topics that came up at prior city council meetings is whether the city should also consider instituting what we refer to as an alternative voting method for council member elections. So what does that mean? Well, general law cities are required to use plurality voting, which simply means that the highest vote getter wins. So if there is one person running for office, well, they win automatically. If there are 2 people, the highest vote getter wins. If there are 3 people, the same, so on and so forth. However, charter cities are authorized under state law to implement an alternative method such as ranked choice voting, approval voting, or variants of those voting methods, and you heard about those at your last study session. So the city council did receive a presentation on those. And one of the takeaways from that presentation is that those methods may only produce different results, or only would produce different results, if there are more than 2 candidates running for any given seat. Because obviously if there are only 2 candidates running or fewer, then all of those methods end up with the same candidate being the winner. So a question for the city council to ask themselves is to identify what reasons would the city have to consider those alternative voting methods, and that would help the city council determine which of those methods to select, because they can be complicated to evaluate depending on circumstances. And in addition to that, one of the things that staff has not done is obtaining information from the county to determine what methods could be implemented and at what cost. I think you heard in the presentation that the county has to be on board, so to speak, with the institution of those alternative voting methods in order to properly conduct the election. So for the city council, one of the other tasks for tonight is to determine if the charter should include a feature such as alternative voting methods or some of the or all of the other initiatives in the staff report. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important for the city council to consider the effect on the potential success of a charter city measure and that integral tax if you include alternative voting methods and or those other features as part of the charter. So the last slide for the city charter discussion is a slide with 4 basic questions on it. And if I might suggest, we'll keep that slide up so everybody can look at it for a few minutes. And once the city council chooses to take public comment, I don't know if there are members of the public here at the meeting, but if there are some, now would be a good time to perhaps take some public comment, and then have the city council provide direction for staff about these 4 questions. Do you want to move forward for the charter development? Do you want a charter with an integral real property transfer tax? And if so, what's the definition of that, of commercial property, as the city manager indicated? And then the third question would be, should the charter include some or all of these other provisions? And then finally, provide some direction regarding the potential structure of the tax, as indicated above. So I'll pause now with everybody's assent and see if perhaps the mayor might want to call for any members of the public to comment, and then have the city council provide staff with some feedback on those 4 items.
Thank you, City Attorney. Thank you, City Manager. And as the City Attorney said, let's see if there are members of the public that would wish to speak on the which is being asked for council direction, and there are 4 items. And if you could raise your virtual hand at this time, would be very much appreciated. And then we'll go ahead and ask the city clerk if she can assist and bring the folks in, please.
The first speaker is Aros Harmon.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I joined a little late. We are commenting on the topics on the agenda.
Thank you for asking. Right now we're on the charter city question.
Yeah, okay. And I am really pleased to see the city considering this. I've talked with many of you individually that I think chartering is a good direction to go. It gives us the opportunity to take control over more aspects of our city governance and diversify our revenue base. So kudos to the council for putting this on the agenda. I'm concerned about a couple of elements on this. I know some council members have been in favor of getting rid of the citywide mayor, which I think is a bad idea in terms of sort of the sense of government legitimacy, that there is value to having somebody chair our council meetings, even if ultimately their vote is first among equals, that having somebody who, in an official way, in a direct way, is elected by all of us is a good principle. And on top of that, having just gone through districting, if we change our number of council members from 4 to 5.
I'm sorry, Arles, I really apologize we do have that on the agenda right now. This is just in regards to providing next step on steps for charter city. But I guess maybe encompassing all that with it.
I guess
it should be in a charter. So
I was thinking of it as elements of chartering. Okay. All right.
Thank you for the clarification. Please continue, Arles.
Yeah, I mean, I'm basically done. That was my point, was that with having just moved to districts, if we change our number of council members, we'll then be on the hook to redistrict again immediately, unless we did abolish districts entirely, which is a separate topic, which, we could go to a proportional representation system and then we would never have to pay for districts again. But moving to the rotating mayorship while still districted, we'd incur, I don't know, whatever, hundreds of thousands in new expenses, which seems like a bad plan. Anyway, that's what I had to say. Sorry if I joined a little late, so I may have missed what the intended scope was.
No, thank you very much for your comments, and certainly when the topics come up that are of interest, please feel free to chime in again. We'd appreciate it. Next speaker, please.
We currently have no other hands raised.
Okay, with no other hands on the question of the charter city direction by staff, and there are 4 items. Thank you very much. And maybe we can open it for comments from colleagues. Councilmember Hamilton.
So should we ask questions on all 4 things, or are we going to proceed through them one by one?
Excellent question.
Mr. Mayor, if you will.
Please, City Manager, guide.
Questions on the first part of this presentation, which is mainly about the charter development and commercial property transfer tax. There are separate and distinct presentations around elected mayor, term limits, campaign finance reform, and we have a question with regard to alternative voting mechanisms. Does the City Council wish to have that included, and staff to do more work on that? But right now, charter and commercial property transfer tax.
Got it. Okay, so I do have a question on the transfer tax information. First of all, I'm here. Sorry, I could claim all kinds of different reasons, technical difficulties, but the volume on my computer was turned down, and I was reading the staff report, so I'm going back over it again. So my apologies. My question is, there was a mention of exemptions for government property that are standard. Does that include school property? So, for example, the district were to sell a property, would that be automatically included from anything that we would do?
Property tax. So, Councilmember Hamilton, we will look into that. Yes, the typical exemption applies for, the government exemption applies to school property. I think the question is, if a school is selling a property for profit and not acquiring property for their own use, is there a tax upon that? We can't answer that question right now, but in general, the government exemption does apply to schools.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That was my only question. I have comments and opinions on them, but I will let my colleagues go. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Hamilton. Thank you for asking kind of the process through this. Councilmember Medina.
Yes, first of all, I wanted to thank staff for bringing these items to us. We're trying to get a lot done. And with that said, I want to make sure that we move forward with the charter that is simple as possible to make sure that we get the main thing that I think San Bruno needs is the revenue side of things. We can do that by keeping the charter super simple, and the rest of the items that can go to the voters, go to the voters. But I don't want to get too far ahead, so I'm interested with moving forward with the charter, with the real property transfer tax, and we could talk about the details of how we define the commercial later, if that's okay with everyone.
Vice Mayor.
Yeah, thank you for bringing this up. I was actually just watching the 2020 meeting when this was originally presented. I wanted to ask just some questions around the this particular item. So if we move forward with this now, in I think every staff report, there's a discussion around an extra item is $10,000. So if one of the option is adding these other things, including the term limits, that's on number 3. Are we paying one fee for the charter with all of those components, or are we paying additional per component with the charter? Does that make sense?
Yes, Vice Mayor Mason, thank you. Your question does make sense, and I think the answer is that every separate ballot measure would be an extra approximately $10,000. If all of those items or some of them were included in a charter, the charter is one ballot measure. So there would be a small savings in terms of placing additional items on the ballot. Also, though, do keep in mind the information we received is already old. It's a couple of weeks old. And as we discovered before, it's likely to change. So the numbers may go up or down between now and the election. But that was the best estimate we could come up with.
Okay, thank you. And then another question was about the number that we saw in the staff report, and tonight also is the $67,000 to the $2.7 million. Does that include the $300 million sales price for Tan Fran or the $90 million sales price for Amazon?
Vice Mayor Mason, it does include the Amazon transaction. It does not include the Tan Fran transactions because they took place in the current fiscal year. So the last 5 years, it is from 16-17 to 2021. And so inclusive of the Amazon, but not Tan Fran.
Okay, and is that, and 61,000 would be the lowest percentage that was raised, and then the 2.7 million would be the 3%? Is that right?
No, so on, I believe it's appendix, attachment 2 to the staff report, there's a matrix that we can, if it is up, I can share screen.
Okay, and I have it here on my laptop too, if you have the page.
Okay.
Appendix 2.
So, yeah, it's an attachment 2 to the staff report. Now, this is very, very small, and I will zoom in. But what I just want to show is we take a look at all 21 cities, and we have their tax model. And then for each of the last 5 years, running their tax model in the background against our actual commercial property transaction sales, we have the amount of tax that the city of San Bruno would have received. And then we have the average for those 5 years. And so the range comes from the average. And so because the transfer taxes, as we talked about, highly dependent on the economy and sales transactions. For example, if we just look at this one column here for running the Piedmont model, the city of Piedmont, over the last 5 years, the low would be 127,000, the high would be 4.2 million, and the average would be 1.4 million. And so the number will fluctuate every year based on transactions. And then the highest model That 2.7 million, I believe, comes from the city of Richmond. Their tax model, which does a 3% over $10 million. And so if we had the city of Richmond's model implemented, the average would have been 2.7 million. And so there are a number of transactions embedded in here. And just the 5-year look back, if you're looking at, there's clearly 2 years that are higher, 19 and 21. Off the top, I can't remember which one, but I believe the Amazon transaction is in 21. And then there were a YouTube transaction when they purchased the 901 Cherry properties as well. And so we can find those out, but there were some very large transactions that happened in the last 5 years, and that's what's really driving these numbers.
So for this year's purchase, then we're not going to get anything because this hasn't been implemented yet for the Tanfran purchase.
Sure.
Okay. And then I wanted to ask. So there's a distinction between the documentary transfer tax versus the real property transfer tax. So the documentary transfer tax is the general law, and then the real property tax is the charter. And then there's a reference to the municipal code. And I wanted to make sure I'm understanding this. Is the city currently charging this this property tax? It's called the documentary transfer tax. And
Yeah.
Is it possible to raise that without a charter?
No. So the answers to your questions are yes and no. So the city does charge that tax. It is the maximum rate that the city can levy for the documentary stamp transfer tax. And there is no ability for either a general law city or a charter city to raise that particular tax. What the charter city does for you is allows you to levy a different tax, which is similarly named, so it's confusing, but that's the real property transfer tax, and that's what you get as a charter city.
Okay, and then so let's assume that we move forward with a charter city, and we have, let's just say we have a real property tax. What happens to the documentary transfer tax at that time?
So I believe that tax is subsumed into the real estate transfer tax, but I'm actually not 100% sure of that, so we'll check that out and get back to you on that.
Okay, and I can't recall from my reading, does the current documentary transfer tax apply right now to single family homes?
It applies to every sale property.
Okay, so that would be good to know is what happens to those if we move forward with a commercial, and I know we're going to define what commercial is, but if we define commercial to not include single family homes, does that mean that the existing tax would remain for those, and then there would be an exemption for the real property transfer tax?
Yeah, excellent question.
Yeah, well, if I can, Vice Mayor Mason, the answer to your very last question is yes. If the city implements a commercial property transfer tax that exempts residential, the residential properties will pay the documentary transfer tax. The question that the city attorney said that he was going to confirm is if we had a separate real estate property transfer tax on commercial property, do those commercial properties also pay the documentary transfer tax? Slightly separate question, but we'll find out the answer.
Yeah, but that's going to be next. So thank you. The other question is whether there is in the staff report a sentence that says the payment of tax could be negotiated between the buyer and the seller. So I would want to make sure that there's one question is that the tax is not negotiable with the city, correct?
That is correct. That reference in the staff report was articulating that in a sales transaction, the buyer and the seller could negotiate that each pays half or one party pays all, which is typical in real estate transactions. But we would not be a part of those negotiations, and the tax would have to be paid regardless.
Okay, I just want to make sure that there's no doubt or no maze on that one. Let's there was a comment about the condos. Under the definition, could condos then also be considered single family if the condo owner is an owner of one? Or how would we work around that to ensure that there's no, people aren't being disenfranchised because they're in a condo versus a single family home?
Right. So with regard to the precise language, we would certainly draft it such that condo sales would be exempt. I think your question is in the drafting of the measure or the ordinance, what would be said to make it clear that a single family home is exempted and a individual condo sale is exempted. And we don't have that language prepared yet at this moment, but we would certainly ensure that that is clear.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. I'll hold my comments till I hear from the other council members. Thank you.
I had a quick question on the, when it was stipulated from the 61,000 to the 2.7 million over 5 years. Now, is that just the variable over those 5 years, or are you saying the most we would have received is 2.7 within 5 years? Please.
Mayor Medina, I'm just calling up attachment to the staff report.
Thank you.
The range of 61,000 to 2.7 is the average annual amount that would have been received should the city have had a transfer tax implemented at any of these models. So, for example, just let's take El Cerrito, which has a transfer tax of 1.2% on all transactions, and so had that 1.2% tax been in effect in the city of San Bruno for the last 5 years for commercial properties, based on the definition that we showed for commercial properties, which again includes multifamily residential up to 5 units in each of the 5 years. So in 16, 17, the city would have received 1,117,000 the following year, 3.9 million, or the next year, just under 400,000, and then 1.2 million. On average, for the last 5 years, it would have been 1.3 million. And so that the range is again made up of this average line item. And so the 61,000 comes from the city of Gilroy, that has one of the lowest transfer tax rates. A number of cities have this rate, but it's 0.055%. And so that's an average of 61,000 should the city of San Bruno have that rate. And again, the higher rate comes from the Richmond model that has a stratified rate, but an average of 2.7 million.
And back to the Vice Mayor's question when it talked about the tax. So it's no different than sewer lateral, that when you sell a residential property and it has to be inspected, either the buyer or the seller will pay for that lateral should it need to be repaired before the escrow is complete. It's the same principle. It's up between the buyer and the seller, and everybody else is out of it. Correct?
Yes, but I just would clarify on that analogy. The sewer lateral is a fee that has to be, or work that has to be done, and there's an assessment that's done, so it may or may not have to be done. And the sewer lateral is done, yes, before the close of escrow, where this is paid after the, actually sort of, after escrow documents have been signed, and it is typically the title company that would send the check to the county. And so different model, but same potential negotiation where the parties can negotiate who pays it.
Okay, and then most of the cities, and I'm not the best at this, but my understanding is, let's say it was for a single family house in San Bruno, it was a $2 million purchase. That's about $2,200 that goes to the county. And then there's obviously the increase because it's gone up. And I think in the city of San Mateo, they tax all sales, which I believe for the same amount would be around $13,000. So what I'm what I understand too is it looked like in the report it was Redwood City and San Mateo that had the transfer tax, but San Mateo looks like they tax every transaction. And I'm wondering what Redwood City does and why do they go to that extreme opposed to maybe what's being considered here?
The best answer to that is to go back to this table. Mr. Mayor, you mentioned a potential $2 million sale and a value of the tax that would be paid. I didn't totally catch the math between the two, but just the reason why it would be different in Redwood City than San Mateo is that Redwood City has a transfer tax of 0.055%, whereas the city of San Mateo has a transfer tax of 0.5%. So it's just an order of magnitude different on the tax that each of those cities have, which is why you would pay a different tax in those cities.
And they also tax all transactions.
Yes, they tax all transactions, residential, all residential and commercial.
Thank you. That's it for me for the moment. Any other questions from colleagues? Thank you for going back to that. Appreciate it. So, and comments from colleagues on the council direction that's being asked for. Councilmember Hamilton.
So, going down in order, move forward with charter development. Yes, please. Only big yes on that one. Should the charter include an integral real property transfer tax? It's also yes. If so, should it be limited to commercial property? Yes. And if so, what is the definition? Now, as I've been thinking about this for quite a long time, and I had actually thought of it, what I would always pictured in my head for how to exempt residential was actually the same model that I believe was used to do the simulation, which is that units of only buildings with units, or only residential buildings with 5 or more units would be subject to the tax, and anything smaller, whether owner occupied or not, would be exempt. I would also be interested in exploring for commercial properties if there could be a way to exempt, and we would have to work out how to do that. It would probably have to be based on value, and I'm trying to avoid value because values are just going crazy, up, down, and could get out of whack at some point. But what I'm trying to avoid, I think everybody wants to avoid single family homes, and the vice mayor asked the same question I was going to bring up here, where if I own a condo and I'm selling my one condo, that should be exempt. If I own a building with 30 condos in it and I'm selling the whole building, that's not exempt. But if I'm a store owner and I own my one building and it's of a certain size, I would like to explore having that tax to be exempted or smaller, because I want to try to protect our small businesses as well. So that's something I would want to consider there with the real property transfer tax. Regarding the charter, I agree with what Councilmember Medina said earlier, I think that we put the charter on with just the transfer tax and not the other items, because if I'm a voter and I really, really hate term limits, although no on the whole charter, and then none of it goes through. So even though it's more expensive, I think they should be separate items. And then I think I already gave some ideas on number 4. So I'm happy to clarify any of my statements if needed, but that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Other colleagues? Councilmember Medina.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. To not be repetitive, I'm ready with one and yes on two, and we could further define what the commercial property is. My question to staff, one of the questions for now is, are we intending to do a poll on this city charter?
Thank you, Councilmember Medina. We are in conversation, and I believe getting ready to enter into contract with a ballot poll consultant like we've used in other polls, with the goal of having a likely voter poll out in the field, as they call it, in the month of May. And so we are planning for another study session with the City Council in April to discuss the contents of that poll, as well as at that point, make sure we narrow down on either the rate that council would like to consider, or a few rates to poll on, and we will use our ballot and poll consultant for advice on that. And so absolutely, there will be a poll, and in many ways, depending on the directives from the meeting tonight about what potential ballot measures we're moving forward with, will inform that poll. There's some poll science. You don't want to poll every potential idea, and so you really want to narrow it down and focus it. And so hence why we're having this conversation today, to narrow down those issues that we would put in the likely voter poll.
Thank you.
Other comments or feedback for staff from colleagues? Councilmember Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, in listening to the comment we got from the public, from Maros, regarding the potential of having a charter and what opportunities that offers the city, it really seems that we're selling this process short in doing this. And in getting through the staff report and seeing that there is another method of developing charters, which is to have residents elect a charter commission that actually gives some deep insight to preferences and potential benefits of the charter, and then having that presented to the rest of the voters seems like a very robust and thorough process versus what we're doing here, which is basically staff saying, yeah, let's do something skinny, throw one thing on there, and then let's just put it out there on a ballot. The property transfer tax, I know it relies on having the charter, and it's hard to say no to extra money, but it seems to me that if that's the only thing that we're doing with this charter, it seems like a wasted opportunity. And, I'm still having a little trouble with the property tax as well. I mean, the conversations we've had, sort of sidebar conversations around how we define commercial is still concerning, who really is not impacted by this. If you're an individual, or you happen to have invested in some commercial properties, this would impact your basically the value of your properties, and it's not insignificant. And I know that we've coming up to this conversation, we've been thinking about the Walmarts and the Tanforans and the YouTubes and all these huge corporations, which would probably not even flinch at this proposal. But there are plenty of other smaller property owners that would definitely be impacted by this, and it's not insignificant. The argument about whether it could be split or negotiated between buyer and seller doesn't really change the fact that it does impact the value of the transaction, and somebody has to pay it. And so it either disincentivizes the seller from selling, or the buyer from negotiating with an otherwise more beneficial price. And so it does have an impact. I don't think it goes without hurting somebody. And so I still have concerns around that just because somebody is doing this for business does not minimize their interest in preserving the value of their investment. And so, I still have an issue with taxing them. And I haven't heard anything that really convinces me that we have a clear definition of a threshold that would somehow make that more palatable to me. So that's where I stand on that.
Thank you. I have some similar concerns. I like the commission idea that was in the staff report because I think it also allows thoughtfulness and all the options or opportunities. Because once you start a charter, and again, you want to keep it simple, but also it can be changed. And if you do want to make modifications to it, it does have to go back out to the vote. And so that is something. Also, when we have, when we're talking about, I think we're thinking large commercial properties. I mean, and Councilmember Hamilton was saying, like, I hate to use a dollar amount because things are so fluctuating in what things are going for. I mean, is it that we use parcel size? Does that deem what a commercial property is, rather than, it's 5 units and above, or it's 3 million, et cetera. I also think, with some of this too, it is a tax, and I know now that we have the impact fees or community benefits, property tax increases. There's fees that obviously are going to be collected as work gets done and people make changes to the commercial areas that they may acquire and then develop. So I also have a concern in regards to that as well. So that's where I'm thinking the commission idea would maybe have to really give it a global, holistic view. And is this the only thing? Because once we do this, I think this is something that is going to be around and it can be modified at every election if majority of the council or petition comes in from the residents. So those are some of my thoughts. City manager, that probably didn't help you immensely, or did it? And city attorney.
No, absolutely, Mayor Medina. Very helpful. This is all about feedback and talking to your colleagues and arriving at direction. And so we've been taking some notes, and so what we have, and I'm just going to talk about the first 2 questions because they're the first 3. For Council Member Hamilton, it is a yes direction or continue to move forward. Councilmember Hamilton provided thoughts on what the commercial property definition should be. And then for question 3, said limit the charter to include the commercial property transfer tax, and all their questions, should the council decide to move forward with them, would be separate questions on the ballot, not integrated into the charter. Councilmember Medina said yes to number 1. Didn't specify specifics on the definition of commercial property, but understanding that there would be engagement upon that later. And then also said with regard to number 3, have a charter with the commercial property transfer tax. Any other questions would be separate items. From Council Member Salazar, I think we heard a desire not to move forward right now on the potential charter measure, with the concept of potentially a charter commission being preferred, and a number of other questions with regard to how commercial property transfer tax would be defined, et cetera. But the core question is, or the core response from Councilmember Salazar is not now commission, potentially later. And I think that was, Mayor Medina, you're saying overall sentiment is a no, not to move forward now and look towards the commission process. I just want to say, and I know that council members know it, but with respect to the commission commission process. There's not enough time to do that commission to have the charter on the November 22 ballot, so that would be a separate effort. And City Attorney, correct me if I'm wrong, the charter has to go on a regularly scheduled general election. Is that true or not?
A statewide general.
A statewide general election. So then the next one would be in November 24th.
There may be one in July, but I'm not sure.
So we would have to come back to you for that. But I just wanted to clarify that. It's just if we're looking towards a commission, it's not the November cycle. And then we did not hear from Council
Vice Mayor
Mason in direct response to those questions that are on the screen.
And I apologize because I didn't see the hand go up. I'm sorry, Vice Mayor. I went first or ahead, and I shouldn't have. I should have deferred to you, but I didn't see the hand up, and that's the only reason I started offering comments. If you have anything, because I know I see Councilmember Hamilton's hand up. If it's okay, I was going to call on him.
I just have just very quickly, just an additional comment regarding, reasoning behind going with, a quote-unquote skinny charter. That doesn't mean that I believe that the charter, that the only thing we ever do with the charter is transfer tax. My reasoning here is that if we push through, or if we propose a charter that has too many things on it, it greatly reduces the chances of getting a charter at all. And I absolutely would be in favor of once a charter is established, looking at other things that we might want to do with the charter regarding voting methods and other things. And for the public that's watching, it's very very key to understand that any amendments that would be made to the charter, any additional things would go on the ballot, and we can't make any change to the charter without going back to the voters. So I don't want it to think that we're selling the process short or not taking full advantage of it by only starting small. I want to start small so that we can actually have a charter, and then we can move forward from there.
Councilmember Salazar.
I think Councilmember Hamilton does raise some good points there, and I agree that any of the items that are listed on the current slide as options are potentially controversial items that could hurt the success of it. But at the same time, I know, although very very limited, there are some other benefits that are clear benefits to the city that could come from having a charter. And I think if we had gone through the process of really exploring all of those options and having a commission that is that's mandated to go and seek out all of these important things that could be potential benefits, that could have actually helped in making or selling the charter, because there are more than a single benefit, which is a tax, and there are plenty of people that are fundamentally opposed to taxes, and so that could potentially be controversial in itself. So, I was looking at it from a standpoint of, what are all the, could we have communicated a greater degree of benefit by identifying other items that other charter cities benefit from, not just one.
Councilmember Medina.
First of all, thank you for everyone for their comments and the discussion. It's a healthy discussion. But we just heard from our city manager to do the charter with the commission. We don't have the time to do it. So we have this opportunity in this election to move forward with one of the items. This council or the next council could decide to go forward in 2024 with a commissioner, and I would be in favor of that. But I think, as Councilman Hamilton, I agree more with him that keeping it simple. Every single other thing here can be put on the ballot, and the people will have the opportunity to vote on it. people, and I would be in favor of allowing them to vote on it. As for the finance reform, we don't need that. So we could do that ourselves. So I'm still waiting to hear. Looks like we have a two to two right now. We just need to hear from the vice mayor to figure out where we're going to go.
Vice Mayor.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're on the, is it 2-2? Am I the deciding vote right now? Is that right, Mayor? Mayor Medina?
I would say, depending on what you say, you could kind of find yourself, yes, at this point.
Okay. So I was the only one in support of moving forward with the charter in 2020. I'm definitely in support of moving forward with the charter now that $300 million is being closed right now. And I think that we looked at this in 2020 and the conversation was around not having enough staff then. I think we will never have enough to do all the things that we want to do to make this as inclusive as possible of our community. But there have been other votes very recently that there were also opportunities that were not taken advantage of. So I think in this particular case, there's nothing wrong with going back to the charter after the election and creating a committee to talk about what else should be on there. And Mr. Harmon brought up a lot of good points. I think he's been a big proponent of moving to a charter for a long time. So is Mr. Tong. There are some people that I think we all get regular communications from. But I think at this point, we have seen almost all of Bay Hill sold. We have seen the entire Tan Fran sold. We have seen Sky Park sold. We are seeing Crestmore sold. And this is why I supported it in 2020. And I feel like we are letting money go. And we are also having to answer to residents asking why there's no money coming in from these sales. And there is a balance, and it has been 2 years. And nobody on this council has been pushing charter cities to say, we want to prioritize this. We want to take those 2 years to create commissions. But we have spent those 2 years on districting, which was not required. So I just want to say, that is the truth. And I think we really have to get serious about what we want in our city. And this is something that I think we definitely need to move forward with. I think as far as a charter with real property transfer tax, how should we define it? I agree with Councilmember Medina that I think staff can come back to us with recommendations. I'm okay with the 5. I'm also okay with looking at the individual business owners. I think that Mr. Hamilton brought up, but I'm pretty open to looking at what the different definitions are. I do just want to make sure that we are trying to protect, in particular, individuals who are seniors who may be trying to take advantage of certain tax incentives where they may want to buy to downsize, allowing for families to move in, multi-generational families to move in to really help with the housing demand that we have here right now. I think as far as the components of the charter, I'm pretty much okay with whatever we get back from the pollsters. So if we have polling that supports any of these measures and we're saving, I think the minimum amount was $10,000 each. Again, we moved to districting over a $30,000 letter. So if that is an issue, I think we can all discuss it, and I can change my vote on that issue either way, but I would be curious to see what a pollster would say. As far as potential tax structure, I'm fine with the slide. I think I want to call it a sliding scale, but I think it has a more official term. But I'm okay with charging, going up or having a higher tax rate depending on the value of the property, as has been done in other cities. So definitely a strong yes, with agreement with council members Salazar that we do need to have some community input, but I do believe that can be done after this next election, and we can have a larger citywide conversation about what else the measure should be, and we can always take it back to the voters. Thank you.
Thanks. And yeah, the vice mayor was, it was a tier that some of the cities that was noted as what's referenced. So city manager, does that give you the direction?
I think we do have clear direction that allows staff to continue moving forward. I just want to recap that so we all sort of land and close out this topic before jumping to the next one. And so what I heard was a majority in favor of moving forward on the development of a charter. Comments around the definition of commercial, relative concurrence with the definition that was used in the tax simulation, but wanted to take maybe a look at where that threshold of exemption is for residential properties. At this point in the draft, it's at 5 units, but also asking staff to look into potentially a dollar threshold for commercial properties, potentially to exempt smaller commercial properties from payment of the tax. A majority to, with respect to number 3, move forward. I heard 2 members that were supportive of moving forward with the charter, expressing that it should be limited to the commercial property transfer tax and other questions on a separate ballot measure for various reasons. And then Vice Mayor Mason saying potentially wait until we have conversations with the pollster or maybe even the poll before making that final determination on what's in the charter, what's not. And then with respect to the amount, staff will come back with various models based on the conversations that were had tonight, and we will have that in advance of the poll. So I think we have clear direction with regard to the first presentation. The only thing that we will need to come back to before we close out tonight is alternative voting mechanisms. That was talked about here on slide 13. And so we're going to need direction on the staff look into alternative voting mechanisms. And so my recommendation would be to pause on that before we conclude the night, come back to that as a separate question, but then move forward with the next presentation and the next item, which is on a potential repeal of the ordinance that established the office of elected mayor.
Okay, and thank you, City Manager, and we'll do that. And if you could just keep us on track with that. I do have Councilmember Medina, but before, so what we're doing is we're hearing from staff, we're going to public, bringing it back to council for direction. So, but I do know there's been a hand up, so I'll do it this time. But as we go to the rest of the items, that's how we're going to do it. Staff presentation, public comment, back to council for discussion, deliberation, and or direction. So if we could bring the speaker from the audience in, and just because I'm assuming it's going to be on the topic that we had just discussed, and then we'll go to Councilmember Medina. Please.
The speaker is Sandra Perez Vargas. I'm trying to unmute Sandra. Hi, Sandra, can you hear us?
Did we lose?
Looks like she dropped off from the attendee list.
Yeah, I no longer see her.
Councilmember Medina and Vice Mayor, I think I just forgot to lower your hand, so I'm going to do that unless you wanted to speak. Okay. Councilmember.
I think they have new questions.
Just a clarifying question, Mr. Mayor. For the polling of the exemption, if we look at slide 10, if that can be pulled up, I would think that the polling company would do the poll and ask those questions in 10 of what was the most passable number to define that. So I just wanted to make sure that was what was going to happen with the polling, that we would get some clarity and some numbers on from the public what they thought on those items there with the cursor on it. That's all I had to clarify, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
In response, Mayor?
Yes, please. Thank you, City Manager.
Yeah, so we have meetings scheduled with the pollster, and we'll, at an April study session, come back to the City Council and discuss the components of the poll. Councilmember Medina, totally understand what you're saying. I think there's a little poll science in how you poll for this, and there would likely be a desire not to have a poll where you ask all 5 of these options, sort of single family only, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. So how we ask that question, just know that we'll be analyzing and come back to the City Council for final direction.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else, colleagues? Because we're going to move on to the next presentation. I guess I should announce it. First,
I do have one.
I'm sorry, Vice Mayor.
Oh, yeah.
Apologize.
Okay, I meant to say this earlier. Councilmember Hamilton brought up a good point about the schools, and I would just be curious about the exemptions, not just for schools, but for pretty much any government entity that transfers property back to the city to benefit the whole of the city. What legally is required, is not required, or what ramifications or measures can the city put on a commercial transfer tax for those agencies? I'd just be curious. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move on to item B. That is conduct study session and provide direction regarding submitting a measure to the voters at the November 8, 2022 general election, repealing ordinance that established the elective office of mayor, city manager, and or city attorney.
Very good. Again, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. So we're now talking about the elected office of mayor, and state law does authorize cities to select mayors in 2 ways, either by vote of the people or by selection of the City Council. And in 1977, the City of San Bruno placed a measure on the ballot, Measure F, which was approved and did establish an elected mayor. And Measure G, the one right after F, established a 2-year term. So therefore, per state law, you need a vote of the people for that ordinance to be repealed if the City Council wishes to select its own mayor as opposed to have it be done by a vote of the people. If adopted by a vote of the people, any change would operate prospectively as of the 2024 election, and that's again by state law. As we can see in this slide, if it were only to work. Thank you. The mayor, as distinguished from other council members, does have a variety of duties. This isn't an exhaustive list, but includes many of them. Obviously, conducting the meetings, proclamations, dignitaries, community functions, and so on. And as it turns out, about 65% of cities in the state do have mayors selected by the City Council. About 35% have elected mayors. That, however, is not the same percentage in the county of San Mateo, where the city of San Bruno is, at this time, the only city with an elected mayor. However, the caveat to that is that Belmont appears to be moving toward directly elected mayor. Conversely, Half Moon Bay had decided to establish a directly elected mayor, and it looks like they've decided to abandon that effort. So there's a little bit of back and forth on that, but that's the landscape right now. So there's a couple of other considerations, which is that if the directly elected mayor were to be repealed by the voters, it would require an additional districting process to establish a 5th district to comply with the California Voting Rights Act, the CVRA. And there would need to be additional public hearings, like we conducted previously, to select a new map that would be effective for the 2024 election. So again, the question in front of you is, if you're going to place this on the 2022 ballot, then it needs to be determined whether to include it in city charter or in a separate ballot measure. We've already had a little bit of discussion about that previously. And so in front of you really are 2 questions. Do you want to place it on the ballot? And if so, do you want to do that separately or have it be an integral part of the charter? So I'll pause there and turn it back to the mayor to see if there are any members of the public who wish to comment.
Thank you very much, City Attorney. At this time, I would ask folks that wish to speak if they could please raise their virtual hand, and I would ask if the City Clerk could please bring them in.
The first speaker is Plymouth.
Good evening, council members, and thank you. I think this is a terrible idea. I like the fact that our city is unique in the county. I don't think numbers were given for states beyond California. I think it's actually quite common to have elected mayors in other parts of the U.S. But really what we should be doing is what's good for San Bruno and not comparing ourselves to other people. I think the fact that we have just gone to districts makes it even more important that there is at least one person who is representing the entire city. And I didn't even realize until it was mentioned just now that this would require us to do redistricting again immediately, which that was already a fairly arduous process. Please let's not go through that again. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please.
The next speaker is Aros Harmon. Just one moment while I bring you in. Aros, your hand went down, but I'm going to bring you in case you want to talk.
Yeah, no, I lowered it. Sorry, because you were announcing me. I think you already know I agree with Plymouth. I didn't hear addressed, and I'm curious to hear addressed. Hopefully, this will be discussed. It does seem like if there is a move to charter, like if this is something that can be left out of the charter, both to make the charter less, like one fewer thing to argue about, and if we retain the flexibility to do this by an internal ordinance, like I think tying the hands of future councils with forcing them to go to the voters on issues is generally something to avoid. So I would say that it does seem like if, as a charter city, we don't have to define this, we can leave it up to a regular legislative process for future councils. That seems preferable. But yeah, I think, I grew up on the East Coast. Like, I hadn't even heard of cities where the mayor wasn't elected citywide until I moved to California. It's a peculiarity of California, and I think it's a bad policy. I think that having the mayor be for the whole city is preferable. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please.
I see no other hands raised.
Thank you very much, City Clerk. With that, now done with public input, we will bring it back to council for questions, comments, etc. Councilmember Medina.
Yes, thank you. It's been 45 years since the people of San Bruno voted on this type of selection of the mayor. And I personally think that the city would benefit from it, that I believe it provides an additional way that the council would work together, knowing that you have to work with your other colleagues when you know that that person will be mayor at some point in their term. I do have a different viewpoint. I believe every single council member is looking out for the entire city. None of us here were voted in districts. None of us here, I think, look at it any other way, that we all represent all of San Bruno. And I'm hoping that in the future, even though we do have districts, it will be a little different, but people that are going to be running, they want to improve the whole city. So looking at to prepare about to place on the ballot, I'd be yes. And I think we already covered number 2, that it should not be on the charter. So I think that's all I have to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Hamilton.
So I have a question to start with, and that is and I think I know the answer to it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It seems odd to use, like on slide 19, to use the term appointed. Only, even though we all know that it's one of the 5 elected council members, it makes it seem, it just sounds different than the term rotating. And I guess that brings up the question for how does that actually work? I always assume the rotating mayor, rotates, and there's a rule, and there's rules, and it goes off, and it goes through based on seniority or whatever the rule is, and cycles through the council members, and we would need to decide whether the council member would be mayor for 1 year or 2 years or whatever. I would be in favor of 1. And all of that, but just by saying council selects a fellow council member, that seems to leave open the possibility that a council could elect or could appoint the same person to be mayor year after year after year, which kind of defeats the purpose of having a rotating mayor. So I just wanted to ask, just for clarification on that point, and then I have some comments as well.
Mr. Mayor, if I may.
Please.
So the answer actually has a couple of different facets to it. So it's true that a rotation system would be different than the council member simply making an appointment, and hence, as Councilmember Hamilton noted, could simply appoint the same person every year if they wanted to. However, I would say that the city council, it's not before you tonight to decide exactly what the rotational or appointment system would actually consist of. Right. And if the voters repeal the elective office of mayor, then at some point, either before the election or after the election, the city council could indicate its intent about how the mayor would be selected by his or her fellow council members. I would also point out that in the cities that I've worked with who have a rotational mayor, that rotational system is specified in the municipal code, but it is not, in my recollection, a mandatory rotational system. In other words, the city council always retains the discretion to appoint somebody other than the person called for by whatever rotational system is there. And San Bruno is somewhat unique in that the city did not take that path with respect to the city council selection of the vice mayor. In our municipal code, the vice mayor is selected by a rotational system that is not otherwise subject to modification or change by the city council, except if it were to change the ordinance. But with respect to mayors, most cities have a system in which, in fact, the mayor is appointed through some kind of voluntary rotational system, but it's not mandatory in most codes. That's not to say the city of San Bruno couldn't make that rotational system mandatory. You could certainly do that if you wished.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. Very much cleared that up for me, so I appreciate that. So for my own comments on this, the city attorney made a comment there that San Bruno is somewhat unique in that, and we seem to be somewhat unique in many, 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 many things. And I've always wondered why we do things differently. And when I look at our recent history compared to our neighbors, I don't often think that because we do things differently, it's always the best thing. And I'm not in favor of this solely because literally everyone else in the county does it this way, or almost everybody else does it this way. I agree with Councilmember Medina's comment that, and I made these same comments when we were talking about districting, that having district elections does not mean that a particular council member stops caring about the other districts. One of my passions joining the council was to revitalize our downtown. I don't live near it, and it's not in my district, and that doesn't mean that that I'm going to stop caring about downtown because I happen to live in District 2. The other big main point is, and this the credit for bringing this one up, and it goes to our vice mayor, is the fact that the mayor lives in one of the districts, and that means that that district would be the representatives of that district hold 2/5 of the votes on the council. And so I don't necessarily agree that going to districts means that having an at-large mayor is more valuable. So I am in favor of number one, that we should place it on the ballot and let the people decide. And as mentioned previously, I think it should be separate from the charter decision. Thank you.
Thank you, council member. Other comments or direction by colleagues? Councilmember Salazar.
I would just say that I'm generally opposed to trying to fix something that isn't broken, and I have never heard anyone complain to me about having to vote for mayor. I think some people appreciate having that ability, and I agree that everybody on the council represents the entire city, and it's always been that way. I don't think that will change, but I think people also really don't have a problem with electing their mayor. So, whether we place it on the ballot, I'm somewhat indifferent because, I also agree that people should have an opportunity to voice an opinion. It's just one of those things where we're saying that everything we place on this ballot will cost us another $10,000. And so if we're going to spend $10,000 to ask a question that most people either are indifferent to or might not be in favor of changing, doesn't seem like a good use of public funds. And so for that reason, I would say let's leave it off. But if it's something that moves forward, I have to say I'm not opposed to asking the people, but I am opposed to wasting money.
Other comments or questions, or comments, I should say? Vice Mayor.
I have a question. I know I've asked this before, and I don't recall if we got an answer, but does the city pay anything to have the mayor separately listed on the ballot?
Thank you, Vice Mayor Mason. We have our city clerk in meeting, and so I'll have Melissa, if you will, respond to that because the mayor is elected every 2 years, and so there's the mayoral election that coincides with the general election, and then the mayoral election that is off cycle. And so, Melissa, can you discuss each of those?
Yes. So if I'm understanding the question, the mayor and the council are both on an even year cycle now because of SB 415. And so, for instance, Mayor Medina, his term is up this year, and as a 2-year term, he will be on the November 2022 and the November 2024 ballot. Mm-hmm. And he is listed, the mayor position is listed on the ballot as just like a council member position is, only it will, instead of saying, would you like for this person to run for a 4-year term or however many years for city council, it will say for the position of mayor. And so it specifies the position of mayor instead of council member.
That's correct. And do we pay to have that?
Well, yes, because it is a service, a consolidated service through San Mateo County elections. It is a service that we do pay for to have the mayor position on the ballot the same as we have council members on the ballot.
And so we are paying an extra fee. It's not like you have the council and then the mayor and they're all like a one price fits all, right? You have to actually pay an additional cost to have the mayor separately listed, the position of the mayor separately listed on the ballot.
I would say, I don't know if that's necessarily correct, because it's hard to explain, but without having the county here to explain their billing, we wouldn't get billed separately just for having the mayor item on unless it was a standalone election for some reason. But since the mayor is aligned with the rest of council, we normally would have the council members on the same ballot as mayor. And so the bill comes in for however many seats we are putting on the ballot. So if we have 3 seats on the ballot, one of those including mayor, then that's what we are billed for, not specifically getting a different bill just because one is mayor and one is council member.
Okay, so you're saying, I think if I hear you correctly, you're saying that we pay something extra for having the additional item on the ballot, regardless of whether that's the mayoral seat or a city clerk seat or firefighter seat, whatever it might be. We're paying extra for that additional item.
Again, we're not getting necessarily paid extra just for the mayor position. We get paid for however many seats total are on the ballot, as well as however many ballot measures are on the ballot. It's not necessarily an additional charge just because it's mayor.
If I can, the mayor, just add a bit of clarity. With a mayor that's elected every 2 years, the mayor would be on the ballot in a 4-year cycle twice. With a 5-district configuration, that position that was the mayor would be a 4-year term. So when you take a look at a 4-year cycle, with a appointed mayor, you would actually have one less position in that 4-year cycle that would have been on a ballot, because the mayor position would now be a council position for 4 years. And so based on what the city clerk has said, is there is a delta cost for each position. On a 4-year cycle, there'd be some savings. We don't have that number now, but there would actually, over a 4-year cycle, be one less position running with an appointed mayor.
I think it would be helpful, because I know I've asked this before, but it would be helpful to understand what the pricing is on the ballot. So what is it now? What did we pay in the last election? And then what would it be if the alternative was that you had 3 council members in one and then 2 in the next? I think that might be helpful for some of the council members who express concern about the cost.
Okay, we will follow up and provide that information. We will attempt to seek that information from the county election office and have it for our next study session.
Okay, great. And then I would say for me, I ran on this in 2019. I supported it in 2020. It didn't get consensus, so I'm happy to see this go back to the voters. I think that I do agree with something one of the speakers said, which was about it would have been ideal to review this prior to districting, and I agree. I said it then. But I think at this point, the decision was made by the council to move forward, and I don't know that that should be a barrier, because this was known when that vote was made. I mean, this was one of the conversations that was had. And I actually have heard from a number of people, why aren't we in a rotating mayor city? So I've also heard arguments in favor of keeping an at-large mayor system. But I will say I've heard, I think, from more people to move, why aren't we a rotating mayor city, versus a lot of people who I think are more personal about this because they're very fond of our current mayor. But as far as like a policy discussion around one versus the other, that is something that I do not hear often. It's largely, why aren't we like all the other San Mateo cities? And I'll say that during during the switching of the mayors, the San Mateo Daily Journal did a lot of government watch updates, And I really enjoyed looking up the different mayors, and they, the new mayors would come up and they'd say, my focus this year is going to be mental health or whatever their initiative is. And I think it's very exciting to see something new that can be done and within a scope of a year and just have kind of a new idea and new face out there. So I definitely support, obviously, moving to the rotating mayor and having the voters decide. And ultimately, the voters really get to make that decision. So I'll leave it to our mayor now to
Well, and Vice Mayor, how about the second number there, Steph wanted?
Oh, I would stick to what I said earlier, which is just I'd curious to see what the pollsters say. But I'm honestly okay. I don't think I'm that torn one way or the other.
So, City Manager, you have 3 votes clearly, or you have a majority of the consensus of the council. What I will say, at this point, I'll stay some neutral. However, just so the historical perspective, and that was raised here, is that it transpired because the rotational process was understood, and it didn't happen, and it divided a community. And therefore, that's how the first mayor, Dick Griffin, was elected. And that's been the history since. It hasn't, to my knowledge, hasn't come back up on the ballot to be asked, and there's nothing ever wrong with folks being asked those questions, because it does have to come from, they initiated it with a 2-year term, so they would have to be the folks to reverse that. It does say, as the city attorney said, okay, you can bring it back if the people say go to rotation. That is correct too, where there could be an understanding, but there are cities that have rotate their mayor every 2 years, one town, one city, to my knowledge. And there's also a couple cities that have reappointed the current mayor to a second year, and it usually is by a 3-2 vote. The one thing that I think we are fortunate to have is that there is never a political discussion or a divide in the community on who's the vice mayor or who the mayor is, because it's clearly articulated and stipulated. So that's one thing that I always have felt has been helpful, where we do sometimes read where it maybe doesn't go as smooth sometimes. Vice Mayor.
Yeah, I don't know. You just touched on what I was going to say, Mayor Medina. I don't know if that's a question too, but I do like how certain cities just have an auto-rotate mayor, so there's not a vote, it's not a discussion. I mean, I became the vice mayor in a consent item with like many other items. So I would be in favor of making sure that should this go to the voters, that there just be a very clear articulation of what the process is, so that it's not a vote, it's just an automatic rotation.
And I guess I'd have to ask the city attorney whether that's viable or how that's done. And then Councilmember Medina.
Mr. Mayor, was that a question for the city attorney to opine upon?
Yes, and then I saw Councilmember Medina was about to speak and then not. But yes, I think what I heard from the vice mayor was that it be clear within the initiative that would say it will be on a rotational basis. And can that be established? But really that's established thereafter by council, by ordinance, but as was indicated, it doesn't make it binding.
Right, so if I may, I think the question is it possible for the rotational system to be specified in the ballot measure? The answer is yes. If that were the case, then the rotational system could not be changed by a vote of the city council unless the measure says that the rotational system can be changed by a vote of the city council. Otherwise, it would have to go to a vote of the people to change that particular rotational method. So normally what happens is that the measure is placed on the ballot. Do you want to go to an appointed or rotational mayor, yes or no, leaving the city council with the discretion to determine later what that rotational method would be. Alternatively, you could put something in the ballot measure that says, here's the method, and leave it to the city council, retain the authority specifically for the city council to change that rotational method if it so wished. But if you don't do that, then changing that method would go to a vote of the people.
Thank you. Councilmember Medina, then Councilmember Hamilton.
Thank you. It's my preference to clearly let the public know what they're going to get by voting for this. So if staff could bring back this for another discussion, what the options are, I think we'd be doing everyone a favor by doing it that way, of making sure the public knows I voted for this because it's clear, where it's not in the council's hands. And I think if it was in the council's hands, it would be more likely to, at some point, be a problem. So my preference is to clearly define the rotational system.
Thank you. Councilmember Hamilton.
So I'm also in favor of being as transparent as possible. I'm wondering if maybe we could do it by saying, having a clearly articulated ballot measure that says that rather than it just says that we're abolishing the position of mayor and having the council appoint, that's not enough information. Then you could state it saying having the council appoint based on a rotational basis to be defined by the council or something along those lines, to give the council the ability to adjust it if necessary, but it's still just a method that you're picking between the five, and that's the most important thing to establish clearly on the ballot, that we're appointing from the five, that we're appointing from the five people that were elected by the voters, not, because just saying that it's a point, there's going to be people who look at that and read it and think that we're just appointing some rando, and that's obviously unacceptable.
Thank you. City Hall.
To the mayor, yeah, I think we understand the intent of council on that point, and so we will bring back options and language. Because this is a study session, I do want to take the liberty and delve this topic a little bit more deeply, because it will help us in drafting options. The city currently has a rotational schedule for vice mayor that works on seniority and based on time spent as having served as vice mayor last. But in a district system, you may want to have a rotational process that factors in every district having representation over a 5-year period. And so does the council wish to have any conversations or provide any direction? For example, keep the current vice mayor process, that's the process we like, or look at and provide us options under a district model where the mayor would rotate through each of the 5 districts.
Thank you. Councilmember Salazar.
Thank you. On that last point, I want to say that I was instrumental in changing the way we appoint vice mayors, because I didn't feel that it was beneficial to anyone to have the newest member on the council serve as vice mayor and potentially have to serve as mayor in any situation. I believe if we were to rotate it by districts, we would be back in that situation where we could potentially have somebody newly elected, completely unfamiliar with the process, put into that position. And I don't think it's fair to the person who's put in the position or to the entire process to have somebody new. And so, and that's why we're appointing vice mayors now the way we do, where it's the person who's got the longest tenure rotating in. But I believe there is some flexibility there where if that person decides not to, that we keep going in procession. And I think that if we do anything, that might be the better solution in rotating among the council. And I also wanted to mention that the Vice Mayor raised an excellent point on the cost of the elections. I hadn't considered that there is a built-in cost to our current model that could be at least every other election cycle beneficial. So thank you for raising that point.
Councilmember Hamilton.
So I agree. I do like the idea of making sure that every district gets representation, but then also having somebody brand new coming in and having that person be automatically become the mayor because that just happens to be where we are in the cycle isn't necessarily that great. So I would be in favor of having the ballot measure be flexible in the way that I articulated earlier, and having a system in place that does its best to cycle through, but unless so if District 1 is next and that person is going to be brand new, then we don't go to District 1 and maybe we go to we would figure out what we're going to do there, and maybe District 1 would go to the following year or something along those lines. So, we have to see what the process is and what options we have.
Thank you, Councilmember. Any other comments? Sorry, excuse me, to the city manager. Yeah, I'm sorry. Councilmember,
Sorry,
I apologize.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor. I realized that was a good idea, and so I too would, to tell from personal experience, when I first got elected, I was vice mayor, and it was just like, what? Like it was difficult. So it's great that we changed that, and it'd be interesting to see how like the vice mayor just turns into the mayor the following year, if that was allowed based on if they were reelected and everything. So there is a solution here to pretty much protect the person coming in to be overwhelmed and to have an order in place that helps out with the experience. So thank you.
Thank you. I think everybody, Vice Mayor.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with the comments that Councilmember Salazar mentioned for the reason that we do the vice mayor. So I'm fine with that for the mayor as well when it comes back to us. Thank you.
Okay, good. Staff, I think you've got clear direction about, because I think you were more specific on the vice mayor, but I think you got added input regarding the mayor as well.
Yes. So thank you. And to be clear, I think it's council members Marty Medina, Tom Hamilton, Vice Mayor, Mason as a yes to continue, Councilmember Salazar as a no, and Mayor as neutral. With respect to number 2, separate Councilmember Marty Medina and Tom Hamilton as a yes, and Vice Mayor Mason as a to be determined based on the poll, but could go either way.
I think that's fair. Everybody see that as agreed? No, I see nobody agreeing. Thank you for that. I'm sorry, Councilmember Salazar.
I'll just say, I'm not strongly opposed to it, so I will go ahead and say that I'm also in favor of placing it on the ballot and letting the people decide.
As we said, it's fair to ask.
Mm-hmm.
It's been some time. Okay, if that, then we will move forward to item C. Conduct study session and provide direction regarding submitting a measure to the voters at the November 8th, 2022 general election, repealing section 2.04.015B of the Municipal Code and establishing term limits for council members.
Thank you again, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. So we're on our third of 4 topics for this evening, which is to reestablish term limits for council members, and we titled this section of the presentation in that way because, as you can see from the staff report, and as you'll see from the PowerPoint presentation, term limits have a very unusual and convoluted history in the state of California. In 1977, the same election that established the office of elected mayor, the voters established a term limit of 2 consecutive 4-year terms for council members. But shortly thereafter, there was a number of court decisions that invalidated term limits. And then in 1988, the city actually repealed the term limit ordinance in order to comply with those court decisions. And because the city council chose to take that action without a vote of the people, and you might wonder, how is that possible? It was adopted by a vote of the people. And the answer is because those court decisions essentially invalidated those term limits. So to be on the safe side, the city attorney at that time filed what's called a validation action, which was an action to approve the city council's decision. to eliminate those term limits that were approved by a majority of the voters. And the court issued a ruling in the city's favor validating that repeal of the term limits, and that is now codified in municipal code that you see on the screen, such that there are no term limits now in the city of San Bruno. In 1995, state law was finally amended to clearly authorize establishing term limits by a vote of the people. And so we have a little list here for you of the various term limits in San Mateo County. You'll see they range from Foster City to Redwood City, either 2 consecutive terms, 2, 3, or 4. And that Pacifica is a bit of an outlier in that there are 2 4-year terms in total, whether consecutive or not. So if you've been on the Pacifica City Council for 2 4-year terms, you can never run again. That's distinguished from the other cities in which they only limit consecutive terms. And then finally, the county itself for the supervisors has 3 consecutive 4-year terms. It is noted a number of cities, 15 of the remaining cities, do not have any term limits. As you can imagine, there are a lot of pros and cons, but they basically divide themselves into 2 categories. In favor is that it incentivizes new candidates to run, may reduce the advantages of incumbency. Those who oppose term limits may argue they would reduce institutional knowledge on the city council, and perhaps elected officials would not be as familiar with the complexities of local government than had they been on the city council for more than the specified number of terms. So really, there are only 2 variables with respect to term limits. One of them is how many terms, and the second one is do you apply it to consecutive terms or a total number of terms. So here are your questions. Do you want to place it on the ballot, yes or no? Do you want to have it be separate from the charter or combined with the charter? I know we've heard some commentary about that already. And then the only other issues to determine are the number of terms to limit and whether the limit applies to all terms or only successive terms. So that concludes the staff presentation, and I'll be happy to take any questions, and certainly I know the mayor may want to take some commentary from the public.
Thank you, City Attorney. At this time, yes, let's open it to members of the community who would like to speak. If you could raise your virtual hand if you're interested in discussing term limits. Yes, we do. And City Clerk, if you could please assist me in bringing Aros in.
Aros Harmon?
Hey, this is an issue where, again, I know I've spoken to some of you separately, but I just want to observe that there is like a decent amount of political science research on this topic that is pretty unidirectional, that term limits tend to impoverish the actual sort of experience of the legislators relative to other players in local politics who you can't term limit. So, you know, the big owners of local commercial real estate, we can't limit them to 8 years service. So they're going to be around for 20, 30, 40 years and kind of know where the leverage points are, have a network. And, you know, like the voters, if the voters decide that somebody that's serving on the city council, they don't want them, they can always boot them out. That's what elections are for. We don't need to artificially limit that. You know, or at least if we do, we should consider large numbers. But anyway, I think really we should pay attention to what, you know, the academics have looked at around the world and across time and across our country, and shy away from this.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please.
The next speaker is Plymouth.
Hi, thank you, City Council members, and apologize if I may end up repeating some things that Aros already said. My connection disconnected because I was walking between buildings. I'm still at work. But I just wanted to say that I'm also really opposed to the idea of term limits. We already have term limits. They're called elections. And I find it completely ridiculous that somehow when it comes to politics, people seem to think that inexperience is better, whereas in almost every other profession, experience is considered a good thing. it's going to lead to people, I shouldn't say that it's going to lead to people with short-term visions, but it may lead to that. The idea that if you only have 4 or 8 years, you can only accomplish things that take 4 or 8 years. And gosh, no, this is really bad. As our previous council member who actually recently got voted out, and I'm blanking on her name, it's been a long day at work, mentioned there really are some things that take decades to get accomplished. And if you're constantly cycling through who the people are who are on the council, a lot of those things are just going to get dropped, not because people don't care, but because you constantly have people who are starting from scratch or starting from trying to collect pieces of what somebody else was working on and catch up and translate it. So, I mean, I know there are people on the council who will say, well, let's just let the voters decide about this. But effectively what you're doing is you're letting some voters decide. Other voters can't keep voting for the people that they want to keep in office. So we already have term limits. They're called elections. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please.
I see no other hands raised.
Thank you. So with that, we'll conclude it with public comment, and let's bring it back to the council. And if you could bring that slide back up, thank you kindly. Colleagues. Councilmember Hamilton.
So I just want to clarify, I was reading looking at the actual ballot language from 1977, which fascinating ballot. That's actually what I was reading when I missed roll call. So Proposition C, shall city council members elected in the city of San Bruno after January 1, 1978 be limited to 2 consecutive 4-year terms. So I just want to be clear, because I mean that's it. That's the entire ballot language. I want to be clear. So at that time the voters said you can serve 2 terms, and then that's it. You're up for the rest of your life. Was that what was enforced?
What the ballot measure did was said 2 consecutive terms. You're out. It did not impose a limit on 2 terms total.
Understood. Okay. So that's so if we decide to move forward with it, it needs to be a lot less ambiguous than this wording that was used in the 70s.
Or conversely, you just need to specify what you mean. And like Pacifica did, and like perhaps other cities did, that it's limited to either a certain number of consecutive terms or the total number of terms that anybody can serve on the city council for is X, whatever that number is.
Right. Okay. So just to clarify, the rule that was voted in 1978, you could serve 2 terms, but you had to sit out, and then you can come back and serve 2 more, and then you sit out.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you.
Councilmember Medina.
Yes, thank you. It's hard to argue that we already have term limits, and those are elections. That's absolutely a fact. People can decide whether they want to continue having the same person being their council member. Being that I am completing my 2nd term, and I think it's a good idea to let the people decide here. I know more in my 2nd term than I did in my 1st, and if I was fortunate enough to be on for a 3rd term, I would be even better prepared than during my 2nd. But I believe that the opportunity to allow others to have a cleaner path is important. So I'm in favor of placing it on the ballot. I also think that defining that you could put in your 2 or 3 terms, we can figure that out. And then after that, you need to take a break. And that would be until the next election. Would that be a 4-year break? Would we specify that? So and that would be definitely separate from the charter as I'm going through through this list. So number of terms to limit 2 or 3. Sometimes when you get on the council, maybe you're in a really minority. I felt that's what was the case in my career here, and it takes a long time, as Plymouth said, to get some things done. We've been talking about fixing downtown for decades. So the terms would apply to successive for those 2 terms or 3 terms, and then you take a break. And hopefully by then you're like, you've done enough, and somebody else can come over and take the torch from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Any other comments or direction from colleagues? Councilmember Salazar.
Thank you. Interesting discussion, and I want to say I always enjoy input from our public speakers. Both Aros and Plymouth have always provided brilliant insight into a lot of the topics that we discussed. So definitely thank you for participating tonight and for your input. This is one item that I had thought was kind of a no-brainer, and a past electorate has decided that it was a good thing and that they wanted to impose limits. But in thinking about this, and my own experience on the council, I'm really thinking that it's probably not a good idea. And in hearing, Councilmember Medina say, he's intending to run for his 3rd, which he wouldn't be able to if we decided that there was only 2 terms. Even though one of them may have been a 3-year term, the other a 4-year term, that, if we say 2 terms, that's it. You had a short term, you had a full term, but now that's it. And maybe you were just picking up your stride, getting things moving, but now you're out. And now that we're in districts, it would have to be a 4-year break. It couldn't be a 2-year break until the next cycle. I lost an election, took 2 years off, came back in 2 years, but in this situation now, it would have to be 4 years. And a lot of things can happen in 4 years. People may decide not to come back. I've also been in elections where I was unopposed, and there was nobody else to run. We've got a council now that's got 2 first-time elected people, and as I mentioned, Councilmember Medina is finishing out his 2nd term. So it's not like we have a problem with people not leaving. That may have been a more reasonable argument a few years ago, where we had some council members that had been in office for a long time, and again, some of them had run unopposed for many election cycles. But I don't think that there's a problem here to fix right now. I think that if we were to place this on the ballot, it's sort of implied when we place things on the ballot that we're endorsing them, or we're thinking that they are a good idea. That's why we want permission from the electorate to do these things. And in this case, I really think it makes our job more difficult. If we are limited in the amount of time that we have on the council to see things through, it definitely hurts. There are things that I've been working to try to get prioritized since I first got on the council many years ago. Still waiting to get those done, still advocating for them, still pushing. A lot of those things could just be forgotten once I'm not here to champion them, or anyone else who is here to champion them. So there is a benefit to having that continuity. So I'm really thinking that I don't really want to put this on the ballot. We've got plenty of other things to consider anyway, so maybe this is not one that needs to take priority, especially given that we're not facing the same issues we are with complacent council members that are just languishing in office, and there's no way to get them out. I don't think we have that problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments or direction from colleagues? Vice Mayor.
Yeah, I mean, I continue to be a supporter of placing this on the ballot. I think that we should place this on the ballot. There are some good points made tonight, and I think I would just say that it's one thing to have knowledge and have your knowledge growth over many years. But I think at the end of the day, it matters how that knowledge is used. And I think at some point, there are populations that become apathetic at some point. I think in the same way that there's science, political science that supports or doesn't support term limits, there's the same that supports and doesn't support incumbencies and the reality of how incumbencies win elections as well. And so that matched with that knowledge and how that knowledge is used over the years really makes a significant difference to a community, especially the smaller the communities get and the more neighborly they are, because those politicians are your friends. And so I think that this really allows the public to take a break and to have not just new blood and new ideas, but also to have members of the public see that there might be an opportunity for something different out there than is known or has been known in San Bruno in some cases for 20 plus years. So I would say that I think separating from the humanistic part of it, I do think there's a definite benefit to term limits. Separate from the charter or combined, I stick to the same thing I've said along the previous items, is whether it's, let's see what the pollsters say. Number of terms to limit. I do think being in government in my regular life as well, outside of the council, I do think it takes time for capital projects. So I saw, I don't know which one it was, but I want to say like 12 years, consecutive 12 years. With a non-limit. I was actually just talking to a council member from another city that has a limit, and you can't ever run again in a lifetime. And so I'd be okay with 12 years, kind of you rotate out, and then let the public see what else is out there. And if the public wants to vote you back in, then that's fine. I think that's very democratic. But I think in the same way that we are asking the public to make this decision, we should also allow the public an opportunity to vote that person if they feel like they were better than the person that stepped in, or not, right? Because you'd have to run again and not have incumbent as your description on the ballot measure. Applies to all terms or only successive terms, and I think I just answered that question. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Hamilton.
So I'm going to agree with the Vice Mayor here. I was going to say a lot of the same things. I think, at least for me, but I have a suspicion that it's true for all the council members. I was one of the many things that I learned that was a kind of a rude awakening after becoming elected, is just seeing how difficult it is to put anything ahead. But I also don't think that is a reason to just allow unlimited term after term after term, because it is, incumbency is a real thing. And, we saw in the 2020 election that, a lot of people came out to vote in the presidential election because it was so important for the country. And a lot of those people, there's a certain percentage of those people going down the ballot were like, well, I didn't study the rest of this stuff, so go check incumbent. And that's a thing. That is actual real thing. So I am in favor of putting this on the ballot and letting the voters decide, but I would want it to be 3 consecutive terms. So 3 consecutive 4-year terms with no limit on total number of terms in a lifetime. One other comment, just for to settle an academic debate. I believe Councilmember Medina would have been able to run again because he did not serve 2 consecutive 4-year terms. He served a 4 and then a 3. So he would be able to run a 3rd time.
The Mayor,
yes, please.
Can we clarify that point? I'll turn it over to the city attorney. I don't want to play attorney right now.
No, that's okay. I think we both know what the answer is, which is this measure, if it were placed on the ballot and approved, would operate only prospectively. So none of your prior terms would in essence count. You would, if three consecutive terms were placed on the ballot, then regardless of how long you've been on the city council, you could run for you could be on the council for 3 consecutive 4-year terms.
Got it. That wasn't the question that I asked, but that's really, that's something that none of us brought up, so thank you for doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. And for myself, yeah, I'm what I have been asking myself is what is the problem we're trying to fix? And I'm going back and I was looking at prior councils, going back some time when this is the newest council as far as new blood, new folks. And because I'm thinking back long ago, or even when I was a city employee. And so I'm, again, trying to ask myself, what's the problem we're trying to fix? With the other items we're trying to bring up, and there's probably more to come, potentially, I don't see that this is a critical point at this time for this question going forward. I do know that there have been members in the history of the city who have, in one term, lost for re-election, and there's others that have served more. So there has been turnover and people saying enough, and there are sometimes that we don't win re-election. So I think that's up to the people to decide. And I do know, as in Pacifica, Vice Mayor had mentioned, I spoke to somebody too in Pacifica over Council of Cities matter, and it is truly 8 years for life. The interesting thing is when they proposed that measure in Pacifica, the incumbents were reelected. So it's just kind of ironic how even they came a very stringent time. But anyway, I think clearly what I've heard is 3 that are yes, 2 that are no. I've heard that 2 said 3 considered, not for life.
Mr. Mayor, we can't hear you when you turn your head.
Thank you. I appreciate you doing that. Seriously, let me get my notes over. What I was saying is I had heard that there are 3 yeses, 2 nos. I also heard from 2 that there are 2 3 consecutives, and I believe Councilmember Medina was 2 or 3 consecutive, but had mentioned both is what I had written down real quick. Okay, good. Trying to get better. Okay, so I think we're good on that topic. Just hold on. I see that I have a hand up in the audience. I'm going to, just to be fair, and as I did it before one other time, but I don't want to keep doing this. So we're almost concluded. So why don't we go ahead and open up to the member of the community that's been here and here with us this evening. City Clerk.
Terry Chavez.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, whenever you're ready.
Yes. I'm ready. Yeah, I apologize. I must have written down the wrong time. I thought the meeting started at 7 o'clock tonight. I apologize. Thank you, Mayor Medina, council members, and everyone for allowing me to speak. I just wanted to read a little bit of this article from December 22nd, 2020. It's an opinion piece in the newspaper, and I couldn't say it better myself, but it's from Dr. Melissa Michelson. She's the Dean of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Political Science at Menlo College. She's talking about district elections and the reason why it's important, but she also talks a little bit about term limits. And so I'm just going to read a few sentences here because I couldn't have said it better myself. So she's agreeing that district elections increase democracy, making it more likely that individuals with less financial resources will choose to run, making space for new voices and perspectives. District elections make it easier for local communities to have a political voice. They encourage individuals who are not independently wealthy or easily able to tap into large donations to consider an elected office. Whether district elections are the best option for a city is not determined by the population size, but it's whether historically marginalized communities have a fair shot at getting a proportional share of the political power. Term limits, on the other hand, restrict democracy. They remove what the Founding Fathers believed was the most powerful incentive for good behavior in public office, which is accountability to the public. Term limits have harmed our state government. They remove good representatives who are for their constituents. When term limits are in place, challengers are incentivized, and that's a hard word, incentivized to wait for the incumbent to be termed out rather than to challenge them midterm. This makes those seats even safer for incumbents for as long as they are eligible for re-election, making them less accountable to the public and diminishing democracy. When serving their last years in office without possibility of re-election, an elected member has far less incentive to continue to be responsible to their constituents. Instead, they may have their eye on the next elective office or even a lobbyist. When elected officials know the time in office is limited, they are encouraged to go for a quick, easy win rather than to think about how to solve problems that require long-term solutions. When they are termed out, government loses their expertise and their institutional memory. Once again, I just wanted to read this this opinion piece. It's from about 15 months ago from Dr. Melissa Michelson, the Dean of Arts and Sciences and a professor of political science. I really believe that let the voters decide. We don't want to lose on institutional knowledge. And also, if we have a great community member who's elected, why not keep them in office longer? Let the voters decide. Thank you for allowing me to speak. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. With that, this concludes item C. We'll move on to item D. Final one of the night, conduct study session and provide direction regarding adopting local campaign finance regulations. And I'll turn it over to, I think, the city attorney.
Very good. Thank you again. So this is our final topic for this evening, and we'll start by saying that state law authorizes cities to adopt local contribution limits without a vote of the people. So this is not something that must go on the ballot. It is something that the city council could decide go on the ballot along with whatever other items may also be on the ballot. As indicated in the staff report, the contribution limit's $4,900 per person. That's set by state law, and that includes a very robust set of regulations for compliance and enforcement. Here's a table showing all the cities in the county with their individual limits. With their contribution limits for both individuals and then organizations or entities. And then is a non-complete summary of some other features that are notable of some of those campaign finance regulations and those contribution limits. So, for example, some of them have limits, but also have public reporting of contributions over a certain amount. Others limit loans by candidates and so on. So there's sort of a whole variety of things you could do. Most common is simply just a lower contribution limit of somewhere between $500 and $1,000 per individual or organization. So that's what other cities in the county do. The question for you tonight is whether to follow state limits, and you can do that in two ways. You can take no action at all, or you can explicitly adopt the state limits, and doing either of those things by implication includes all of the other state regulations for campaign contributions. And it's important to note that that the state is then obligated to enforce those limits, not the city. An alternative is you can adopt local contribution limits. Again, the city council could do that on its own or choose to do so by a vote of the people. You can establish a variety of local regulations and exemptions that either are the same or different from state law. The difference is that if you do that, it's going to require local enforcement with associated resources and staff time. And to be honest, staff has not determined how much time that would take, primarily because there's been not a decision or direction about what those regulations would entail. So I think that's an open question. There is another aspect to campaign finance reform, and that is the possibility of public campaign financing. And this came up during staff's research. It's only available to charter cities. There is a specific prohibition against general law cities funding campaigns with public funds, but not so with charter cities. And you might ask yourself, well, why is that? And the answer is that elections are determined by courts to be a purely municipal affair. In other words, the category of things that charter cities can regulate. Those cities that do provide public financing provide some public funds for candidates. It's usually based on the number of candidates running and some sort of city match based on the budget. but staff has not researched this topic. We just know it happens to be out there, and the cities that do it are generally larger cities, Oakland, San Francisco, Berkeley, that are, of course, charter cities. So the decisions for you this evening are, would you like staff to develop such an ordinance limiting contributions? Again, separate from the charter or combined. Do you want to have it on the ballot or not? And then either way, what specific dollar limits would you recommend? And then finally, do you want staff to further research public financing of local campaigns? So that completes my very brief presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions and listen to any input from the public.
Thank you very much, City Attorney. Let's turn to the public to see if there's any comments or questions. And I would ask if City Clerk can once again assist us and bring them into the room.
Aris Harmon?
Hey, so I appreciate the spirit of attempting to limit campaign spending. I was a big fan of the Arizona clean money system, which we had a proposition in California where they tried to pass something similar statewide a number of years ago. Unfortunately, since then, what's happened with Supreme Court precedent is that it has become incredibly difficult to regulate external independent expenditures. And so you can regulate the hard money donations to a candidate's campaign committee, but there is essentially no way to regulate if, you know, some real estate PAC from SoCal or some candidate's, you know, mom or whatever it is wants to spend $4 million on an election. You know, like they have a First Amendment right apparently to do that, to spend basically an unlimited amount of money, which is it's a great frustration for me, and I'm not super opposed to regulating hard money, but I do worry that this will simply drive money from where it's visible, where we know who donated to what, into some of these weirder dark money forms. So I think it's something to bear in mind that you can regulate this, but unless you can get yourself a new Supreme Court, there's really no way right now to get money entirely out of elections. So it is sort of an exercise in futility. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments. Next speaker, please.
There are no other hands raised.
Okay, we'll bring you to the council. Councilmember Medina.
Yes, thank you. I believe in having some limits here. I think 500 for an individual and 1,000 for an entity should be sufficient, especially now that we have district elections. Number two here, it's separate and it doesn't require the charter. The city can go ahead and do it on their own, or the council can do it on their own. And at some point, maybe in 2024, the council could decide to have a commission and they could look into public campaign financing. But I think those are sufficient answers for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Next person, please, that wishes. I would throw something really quick as we're dialoguing, because we do have districts going, but we still have a directly elected position. So obviously there are two sets of cost differences. Maybe that doesn't matter, but I'm just making that as a point on distributing, printing, etc. Other comments from colleagues? Councilmember Salazar, and then got it. And then Councilmember Hamilton.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to say that I am not in favor of doing this, and I guess this is something that we can reconsider at any time. But in general, I'm going to say this also falls into the category of trying to fix something that may not be broken. I don't know that there's been a problem with elections being bought in San Bruno, and even looking at the most recent election, it's interesting to see that probably the person that reported the most donations and expenditures didn't win. And so that's almost, to me, it seems that there is evidence that money doesn't equate to winnings. And I think historically we've seen that in San Bruno, where there's been big dollar campaigns that don't pan out for those candidates. So I don't know that this is a necessity for us in San Bruno. And sort of echoing what I heard from Aros, it does sort of incentivize people to do things more underhanded. If there is an intent to buy an election, to do it in a way that's more in the shadows, and rather than reporting the way contributions normally would be conducted. It doesn't prevent people that have support from large PACs from gaining an upper hand if it does come down to printing and mailing and doing those sorts of things. If that's going to be required in an election, somebody that is limited in how much money they can raise is now going to be at a disadvantage to somebody that may be completely unfettered because some organization can do things independently without contributing to the candidate, but still promote the candidate. And so that's still allowed. And so as Aros mentioned, until you change the laws for everyone, you're only handicapping the people who run here in San Bruno. So again, I don't have I'm not that strongly opposed. I know that elections have been won here with much smaller donations, without spending a lot of money. You can still win the elections here in San Bruno, so I don't think it's going to have a big impact. It's only if somebody does decide that they want to hijack an election and spend a lot of money. There are ways to get around this, and you're only limiting the people that are going to play by the rules.
Councilmember Hamilton.
So I absolutely agree with the argument that that imposing local contribution limits doesn't fully solve the problem. Because of all that's been gone through, and I've discussed this publicly several times. So that is absolutely a thing. I think imposing a local contribution limit would be largely symbolic for those reasons. I am one of those people who was able to prevail against someone with a lot more money without spending a lot of money. I prevailed in a general election citywide. My total budget was $5,200. And over half of that was my own money. So it absolutely is possible. While I do think that such a contribution limit would be largely symbolic, I think it does send a message, though, and I think that message is important, that we don't want that here in San Bruno. We don't want big money in our elections in San Bruno. And so while I am in favor of developing an ordinance, I'm not in favor of putting it on the ballot. I'm in favor of just having it be a council action. And the reason for that has to do with the limits, because I would want the limits to be flexible depending on the economy and depending on the situation. So if we were to put it on the ballot and impose $250 limit for individuals and 500 for entities or whatever it was, and we put that on the ballot, we couldn't change that limit without going back to the ballot, that could be problematic if there's inflation and all those types of things, and it really makes it difficult for folks to run. So for number one, yes, I would like to develop an ordinance. Second, should we put it in the charter? No. Should we put it as a separate item on the ballot? No. And then specific dollar limits, I think I'm fine with what Councilmember Medina proposed. And I also agree that we could look at the public financing option as a future potential if a charter is passed. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Mayor? Oh, and I apologize, Vice Mayor, do you mind for the pause? I just saw a hand go up. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Councilmember Salazar, thank you.
Thank you. So I had another question on whether the contribution limits that we would impose would apply to the candidate, meaning can the candidate self-fund a campaign without limits in spite of this?
Yes, the answer is generally yes. That would be an expenditure limit, and those are by and large unconstitutional in California and across the country. So candidates can spend any amount of their own money.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. Vice Mayor?
Yeah, I think that's, I will say that one of the questions that I think is reasonable around what problem are we trying to fix? The only thing I'll say is that when I ran for office in 19, these are issues that I ran on and I got elected with the highest vote count. These are the same issues I brought up in 2020 when I lost to Mayor Medina by 9% of the vote, telling me that there is support for these ideas. It's not necessarily the person, it's the ideas that are coming forth. So I think that while we look at different methods to improve representation, there have been many brought up tonight. Districting was brought up 2 weeks ago, but this is another one that really I think can improve the representation in San Bruno. And when we look at funding campaigns, Councilmember Hamilton really hit the nail on the head for me, which is not so much, there's so much money being spent on campaigns and, that they didn't win the election anyway, being, they, whoever that might be. But I do think it's a matter of whether we as the citizenry believe that this much money should be spent on a local campaign. I have been naive to larger elections. I've been actually blown away at how much money is spent so far on the local, congressional elections, the assembly races. And understanding now, I think having gone through the election cycle, that elections are very expensive. And you have a lot more of a population to deal with at the higher levels. And so understanding that, but also understanding that San Bruno isn't that big. And especially now that we're moving to this districting section or this districting model, I mean, there's even less of a need to really fund so much. I mean, I think that part of what, for me, I want to try to do is not just say San Bruno is not okay with, overspending on these elections, but really encouraging the citizenry to get out and get involved, go and knock on doors, get to know people, because your time is valuable, but that's not a cost that you put into your filings, right? And so it really encourages people to get out and get to know your district, get to know your city. And so I would say as far as local contribution limits, I do support the campaign contribution moving forward. I do think that separate from charter or combined, I would say the same as the previous ones. Let's see what the pollsters say. I'm not wedded either way. Specific dollar limits, I find it interesting when you see some cities have decided not to move to campaign contribution limits, but those cities that have actually tried to get away from campaign contribution limits under the new state ordinance or state rules have actually been met with grief from the public saying, no, keep the lower contribution limits. And I think the most recent one was Burlingame that went back in their conversation to having their local contribution limits as opposed to getting away from them. So it's just, if you do a search of some of our neighboring cities, I found that kind of interesting, that once the contribution limits have been established, it appears that the citizenry does not want to stray from them, which shows me that there is support for them. And so I'd be fine with what Councilmember mentioned, which was $500. And I would definitely support that on individuals spending their own money on campaigns. if that is even an issue. And then as far as public campaign financing, maybe if we get a commercial transfer tax, we'll have a little bit of money to give to individuals who want to run for office. I would definitely support that, and I would support that though as a larger conversation that we've talked about if we want to expand the charter. So hopefully that helps. Thank you.
And just to clarify, because I thought I was writing down 500 and 1,000, is that what I heard?
No, I didn't say 1,000. I just said 500. But I'm actually open to what staff recommends. So what are some of the local ones? I believe some of the local cities are $500 and $600, and I'd be okay with either.
Yeah, I was just trying to write down. I thought I saw Councilman Medina and Hamilton with 500 and 1,000. I just want to make sure I'm writing it down correctly. Okay, so just wanting to know where we're at. So you were saying more like 5. Yeah, for me again, I'm the state statute's already began, so that's already in effect. I think what I need to hear is truly the one slide that said it's going to have to be done by staff internally when we take that. So I know what we hear as far as resources and bandwidth, etc. Not to be negative, I'm just saying this is what we're told. So I want to know that that can be accomplished because obviously the state regulates it now. We're going to bring it in-house and have staff time, but when the question was asked, how much of the resources or time, it's not known at this time. I'm not sure when that can be. I'm not even sure how you quantify it unless I guess you ask other communities that are doing it. So until I get that information, I'm imposing something on staff that I don't know really what the end result is. So, but I think we have direction, which is yes, a local ordinance, yes, to bring something back, and yes, 500 to 1,000. There seemed to be some consensus toward that.
Mr. Mayor, if I will, can I ask a few clarifying questions?
Okay, please.
If you will. So,
yeah, please.
I don't think that we've heard a majority to proceed forward and place it on the ballot. We have heard 3 council members say, yes, they're interested in the idea, but 2 of those council members said on the ballot or alluded to it being on the ballot, and 1 clearly said, I'm in favor, but I would like the city council to adopt this and not have it on the ballot. And so just want to highlight that issue and bring it back because this is an item that does not have to go to the voters. The city council could implement this by ordinance. I have some other follow-up questions, but
yeah. I think on that one, I thought on Councilmember Medina and Councilmember Hamilton, I believed it was not to go to the ballot. It was to bring it up in an ordinance form. And Mr. Salazar, not at this time, but Vice Mayor, I don't know if I don't think I can write down other than yes, but I didn't quantify it on my notes.
Yeah, I'm okay with council listing at the council level. I'd be okay with the voters, but since we have 2 already in favor of staying at the council level, I'm fine with that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking that question, City Manager, and please continue with the clarifying that we need.
Yeah. So then, with regard to the specific dollar amount, we've heard 2 council members that were in favor say 500 for individual, 1,000 for an entity, and then Vice Mayor said yes, 500 for the individual, but interested on sort of staff recommendations. So what staff would provide is not a recommended contribution limit, but the benchmarking data that we provided in the chart for San Mateo County. And so for those entities that have a limit lower than the state limit, it is either 500 or 1,000 or 1,000 for the entity. Actually, only 2 entities have 500. That is EPA and Half Moon Bay. The other cities that have a lower limit peg that at 1,000. And that is Belmont, Burlingame, Redwood City, San Mateo City, and San Mateo County. And so the going majority And so with that, is there any direction that council wants to provide at this time, or we can come back to that later?
Again, I think you summarized that well, that it was 500 or 1,000 by Hamilton and Medina, but Councilmember Hamilton.
I'm in favor of 500 and 1,000. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Vice Mayor?
Yep, I support 500 and 1,000 as well. Thank you.
And I had written down Councilmember Medina as such as well. So, okay, that we have that answered. Next,
sure. One other question, potentially, to if we are to bring this back for the city council to implement by ordinance, is the desire for to do that, let me just say ASAP, meaning so it would be in effect for the November 22 election, which would be a fairly tight timeline given that I think the candidate filing date is pretty soon, and we need to have all that information prepared and ready, and then have the implementation structure in place for this upcoming election pretty soon, or it's council's desire to get through the ballot conversations and staff bring forward an ordinance so that this would be put into effect in the next city council election.
Councilmember Hamilton.
So the biggest factor affecting my decision on that question is the local enforcement piece, which we learned from the presentation is going to require staff time, but we don't know how much. So if this is going to be something that's unplanned for and crippling in short term to be able to put this in place for this election and then have us try to enforce it, I would want to know that. So that's what's going to drive the decision for me. Yeah, if we're going to do it, yeah, let's do it. But we have to know what the cost is and what the cost is, both in money and effort, and what potentially is not going to get done because we're doing this. Now, all of those are important factors for me.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or direction to the city manager? Vice Mayor, then Councilmember Medina.
I support staff moving forward with this. I don't know as far as time goes whether it can be done in time to actually implement it by the November election. I would imagine it actually has to be implemented months before. But I think if it could be done by the November election, that would be great. Like, meaning there's something that comes before us with a vote and then be effective the next election. So I'd be okay either way. I don't know that it's realistic that it's going to be done in the next maybe 2 months to be effective for the November vote.
Thank you, Councilmember Medina.
If staff can do it and it doesn't take too much of their time to get it completed, I'd be in favor of doing it for this election. We did bring this up a couple of years ago, and it would be nice to have it done for this election. I think it'd be fine. But those are my comments.
Okay, and you had already heard from me. I think knowing the staff time and resources, I think that's critical. So that's my opinion. Any other comments?
So on that point, it would be the city clerk's office that would be the implementing body for this, and so we will bring forward to council information on the ability for it to be implemented in probably the next 2 to 2.5 months. So it would be effective, and candidates would know that when they pull all their papers, etc. And so we will set about that work. The last question.
Hold on. I'm sorry. I just want to clarify. So, because I've heard different comments. So, as far as you're hearing it, it's moving ASAP for it to be done when filing is done by the clerk's office?
No, what I'm hearing, sorry, Mr. Mayor, what I'm hearing from the city council is a desire to have information on what it would take to implement it for this year. And so we will set about doing that work. Potentially by our next study session in April, have that information for you to make a don't think we would be prepared to have the ordinance by the next study session, but we could have information on does the city have the ability to both draft the ordinance, implement it, and enforce it this year, and what cost there would be for doing that. Because it's a localized ordinance, it's local enforcement, not state enforcement.
Correct. So, and thank you. And I don't. Do you have any more on this topic?
Yes, there's one more. It
Please.
goes without saying, or it may go without saying, but I just wanted to say it to clarify. When we talk about campaign contributions, we've been using the term city council. I just want to be clear that it is the mayor and the city council. That's how we've interpreted this, so that campaign contribution limit will apply to the district council members as well as the mayor. Now, the city council can decide otherwise. I just want to make that probably should have been a fifth point, but we should clarify intent for it to be the entire city council inclusive of the mayor, or is there a desire to do something different? And we would need to, of course, look into how that would be structured. Full stop.
Thank you, Councilmember Medina.
I'm fine with the same numbers, being that currently mayor is elected from all of the districts. 500 and 1,000 seems a pretty healthy contribution limit. Thank you.
Councilmember Hamilton.
I concur with Councilmember Medina.
Any other comments from colleagues? Vice Mayor.
I concur.
Okay. So you've got, I think we've got good and clear direction. And City Manager, thank you for clarifying things for us, just to be safe. And yeah, council usually is all. I didn't miss anybody, did I? No. But City Manager, I did not want to forget that you wanted us also to go back to alternate voting.
Yes, so that was our included in our first item. I believe it was slide 13. So I'll just back up to that because it embedded in these conversations or in that conversation with regard to a city charter is does the city council wish to direct staff to prepare a potential ballot measure on alternative voting methods as a separate item, which I think would be in alignment with the prior direction that we received. So you did have that, or embedded within the charter, which could be an option. So we didn't delve down deeply to this topic, but we did want to come back to highlight it because we did recently receive a presentation and there has been conversation about it.
Thank you. Vice Mayor.
Yeah, so I think that I just am not comfortable right now. I think this is something that we need to involve the public in. I think it should be part of the charter conversation. It sounds like there's support for the charter committee. Not because I'm not in support of this. It's just similar to our previous vote. I'd like to learn more about it, and I don't really want to be rushed into this process. And I also think we should get more input on this before we move forward, this particular item. Thank you.
Councilmember Hamilton.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we're ready to put this on the ballot. We have, there's another alternative method of proportional representation that we really haven't talked about. So I wouldn't want to rush something so important onto the ballot. And I've already stated in this meeting that I'm not in favor of putting other stuff on the charter. And you can only do this if the charter passes anyway. So it just seems to make sense that this is something that we should return to later.
Other comments from colleagues? I would say I don't think we are ready. I think the commission, like was talked about, maybe what was I think? And again, when we're doing this, and I think what the bigger picture was also is, do we want to put it in the charter? I think we kind of heard no. But then the other factor was it's also about the county, right? So the county has to be kind of on board, San Mateo County, the elections office. Is that going to be a cost to us? And the items there. So, I mean, all of that I think really needs to be more looked into as well. Because if we're the only one in the county that's going toward that, and they say, well, that's great that you choose that, and here's the bill, that could be daunting. So I think those are things, too, that we had brought up before. Councilmember Medina. You're on mute.
One more button to push, sorry. What I was saying was I think I'm agreeing with everything that's been said. I think that to try to do it right now, I prefer to go through with the commission. We had 2 different types of voting methods, and we really didn't have too many people listening in during that study session. And probably other than Aros, no one else contacted me about it in all my time on the council. I'm interested in it seems interesting. I am interested, just that I don't think we really need to do it yet at this point. It would just make going to district elections and doing this in the same election, I think that's a lot. So those are my comments.
Okay, any other comments from colleagues? City Manager, Vice Mayor.
I was just wondering if I can have a minute after this item, because I want to go back to another item just to ask a clarifying question.
Absolutely.
I don't want to confuse the topics, though.
Great, thank you. City Manager, does that give you guidance on this topic?
Very clear guidance, thank you. It's nice to know where we stand on that, and we have clear direction on the other items.
Thank you. We're going to go back to Vice Mayor. Wanted to check on something.
Thank you. Just a quick question about the contributions. Was there? I didn't grasp whether there wasn't enough support for implementation by the November, or just to have it done by November, like meaning having a vote by November versus having a vote earlier so that it's implemented for the November election.
So, Vice Mayor Mason, I did hear you say that, but I heard, I believe from the majority of the council, is if we are going to implement lower contribution limits by ordinance, it would be preferable to do that for the November 22 election. However, the implementation, both cost and capacity to do that, council would like information on. And so what staff will commit to do is bring you back information on the city's ability to implement it in time to be effective for the November 22 election. And if, for example, that's it's not possible, I think the other option would be, or it has a significant cost. The option would be bring back an ordinance to the city council so that it is put before the city council for implementation before November, but it would not take effect until the next election, November 22. So our task is to do some work on what it would take to implement it for November 22 and come back to council for further direction.
Okay. City Manager, City Attorney, is there anything else this evening?
Yes, we would love to summarize that. And the City Attorney has one more slide in summary. I would just like to close out by saying thank you, City Council. I think that this has been a very good study session for us to dive down deeply into topics. And just also remind you and any public that are watching that we are working to separate another study session on ballot items for April. There are 2 additional topic areas that the City Council has asked staff to look into. One is a potential card room tax. The other is revenue for our stormwater system. And so we will come back on those in a study session that is not yet scheduled for the month, in the month of April is what we're targeting. In addition, Council has directed staff to continue work on a number of items tonight. I just want to point out that we intend to conduct polling, and after those poll results are known, the City Council will actually make the final decision to put items on the ballot, and we've targeted that for July 12th. But it has to be done by some date in August that I'm not remembering at this moment. It has to be, you have to take an action by August 12th. We are targeting for that action to occur at your July 12th meeting, so a month in advance. But it is possible that something that the City Council directed staff to work on with the intent to put it on the ballot, you receive polling information and you actually decide not to do that on July 12th. And so I just want to say that because I don't want anyone walking away from this study session saying the City Council decided to put X on the ballot. That final decision will not be done until later, after additional research, after we develop the draft ordinance and have some polling done. So with that, I'll turn it over to the city attorney.
Thank you. There's really not much else. We've already talked about the fiscal impact that was in the staff report. And we've already received direction on all those potential measures. And of course, the final decision for the measures to be submitted to the county is August 12th. And so we're looking at a month in advance for that. That's the end of our report.
Thank you for the report and the opening for questions. Vice Mayor.
Thank you. Just as far as the polling goes, is the polling going to be done then on each item, or is it? I just wasn't sure if that's like an automatic, an overall request when you in the staff report talked about having a polling company come in.
Yeah. So the Vice Mayor Mason through the mayor, that is a to be determined decision. We will have meetings with the pollster, and there is science behind voter polls and a likely voter poll, and so they will opine on the best way to poll for the items that the City Council is considering, and we will talk about that at the April session.
Okay, thank you. And then I would just say, I don't know how it will be worded, but I do think the semantics around the term limit is really important, because in my conversation with a lot of residents, the conversation is constantly, well, we have term limits, right? And the term limit is up after 4 years or after 2 years. And I think the confusion comes, or the aha moment comes, where you say, oh no, but that doesn't end the succession, right? And that's where I have found that the conversation changes to, oh, I didn't know that someone could run with an unlimited amount of time. And so I just want to make sure that we're getting, so we can make an educated guess as council members whether to invest any funds to go on the ballot, but just make sure that's very clear, because I think a lot of the confusion is that people assume term limits means that you actually end automatically at some time and rotate out of office, when that could be one definition, but they are separate and apart from each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other?
Just thank you to everybody for both council, all the council and all staff who've been working on this. I know that there's a lot on everybody's plate. Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, city attorney, city manager, and of course there's a team behind both of you. I know not there tonight, but helping to put this forward. So thank you to all colleagues. Thank you. And it's just a little after 8. So we didn't make Marty's mark, but we did good today. So with that, why don't we go ahead and adjourn to the next regular city council meeting, which will be held on April the 12th, 2022 at 7 p.m. Everybody have a good night and a good rest of the week.
Thank you. Good night.